The FBI hopes this latest video will stir new leads in the murder of 18-year-old Samantha Koenig. Authorities say this surveillance video from Alaska shows Keyes abducting Koenig from her job at a coffee stand in Anchorage on February 1st.
Israel Keyes could be the most heinous serial killer in the United States. What we know about him is very limited, and until his arrest, he barely existed on paper. No one had any idea who Israel Keyes was. He was a killer that had no preferred victim type, no consistent method of attack. He had military training and knew how to evade detection from the police. He drove for miles and miles with potential victims in Canada, the US, and abroad. He drew inspiration from Ted Bundy and called Dennis Rader a wimp for expressing remorse for his victims. Many of his victims' bodies were never recovered, and he made the mistake of confessing to 2. He allegedly went to Mexico to modify his body to be better at killing. Had it not been a few mistakes, he could have gone on for decades without being caught. Part 1. The Disappearance of Samantha Koenig. February 2, 2012, in Anchorage, Alaska, a young barista opened up the Common Grounds coffee stand. When she arrived at work, she immediately noticed something wasn't right. The stand had been left unlocked, none of the closing duties had been done, and the cash register had been left open without any cash in it. She checked who had been in last and was surprised to learn it had been Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old hire that had been a great employee so far. Samantha was still new, but she'd been working at the kiosk for less than a month and had always done thorough closes. She called her boss and told her about her concern. Her boss said that she would take care of it and open up the kiosk as usual. Her boss called Anchorage police and requested an officer to look into things. At that point, it had appeared that Samantha had made off with the previous day's cash and disappeared. The kiosk had a panic button inside, and it hadn't been pressed, and the kiosk didn't look like there were any signs of distress. Officers began an investigation, which initially wasn't taken very seriously. They interviewed her father, James Koenig, who had talked to Samantha the previous evening. She had asked him to bring her dinner. Then they spoke to Samantha's boyfriend, Dwayne. He said that the couple had been fighting. He said that Samantha had accused him of cheating and told him that she was going to a friend's house to cool off. James had attempted to find Samantha that evening. She didn't have her truck with her. Her boyfriend had it. When her boyfriend had gone to pick Samantha up when her shift ended around 8:30 p.m., he had noticed that the kiosk was dark and it appeared empty. He said that he got out and looked in the window and saw that Samantha wasn't there. The tone of the investigation began to shift when the owner of the kiosk gave officers surveillance footage from the night before. It showed Samantha at 8 o'clock, calm, chatting with a customer through the window and making a beverage. The footage didn't have audio, and the customer was out of the camera's range. Something shifted when Samantha abruptly turned the lights off. That was when officers knew this wasn't a teenager that had gone off to blow off some steam. She had been kidnapped. An abduction seemed so absurd. The kiosk was next to a popular gym, as well as a well-traveled road. The abductor had been bold. He also hadn't seemed to be in a rush, having been at the kiosk for over 17 minutes. He had also been able to keep Samantha calm. She hadn't appeared scared until he began to lead her out of the building. Surveillance from a next-door building gave officers another angle. It showed a man forcing Samantha into a white Chevrolet pickup truck. From both cameras, officers could tell that the man was very tall. He wore a ski mask and a black jacket. Because Samantha had remained so calm, officers had been inclined to believe that she had known the abductor. He might have been someone she trusted, as she had seemingly left without so much as calling for help. Her father, James, hounded local police to investigate this as a kidnapping. James was a trucker by trade and was known to have a shady past. He raised Samantha as a single parent and he loved his daughter fiercely. He was not willing to let his missing daughter fall between the cracks of police bureaucracy. He arranged for a candlelit vigil, assembled a group of volunteers to put posters up, and he took donations and established a reward fund. He felt responsible. Had he brought Samantha dinner that night when she'd asked, he would have been at the kiosk at 11 p.m. He had been horrified to learn that he was one of the primary suspects, as well as her boyfriend Dwayne. The only thing James could do was rile up the might of Alaska and keep the case in the public eye and to put pressure on officers to continue investigating. He helped to bring the case to national attention. Samantha was a senior in high school. She was kind and well-liked by her classmates. She was responsible, worked hard, and rose above them despite having troubles in life and was succeeding. She had wanted to work with animals or become a nurse. She was described as being someone who looked out for others, making sure they had enough and were included. Dwayne had seen something the night that Samantha had gone missing. He had received a text from her at 11:30 p.m. saying that she would be spending the night at a friend's house. Then he said something odd had happened. At 3 a.m. he felt a need to go outside, to the front of the house where they parked their vehicles, and there was a man going through Samantha's truck. The men stood and looked at each other for a moment, and then the strange man walked away. He and James searched the vehicle and noticed the only thing missing was Samantha's driver's license that she kept in the top visor pocket. When asked why they hadn't called police, he said that he and James believed that the officers wouldn't file a missing person report for at least 24 hours after Samantha had disappeared. There was no physical evidence in the case. The crime scene had been contaminated when it wasn't contained initially. They had no indication that Samantha had left the state. There was no record of her on any ships, planes, or have crossed the border. By February 17th, Samantha had been missing for nearly 3 weeks when her father got a text message from her phone. The text said, "Connor Park sign under the pic of Albert. Ain't she purty?" Officers suited up. They had no idea what they would find at the park. Connor Park was less than 5 miles from downtown Anchorage, and there pinned to a bulletin board was a Ziploc bag containing a photo of Samantha and a ransom note. The photograph was a sign of life. In the photo was Samantha with a man's hand holding a recent newspaper. The picture was shown to James, and the first thing he noticed was that Samantha's hair was braided, and she never styled her hair like that. Along with the photo was a ransom note. It had been typed on plain white paper and demanded $30,000. The note said that if the demand was met, Samantha would be released in 6 months. The note contained the numbers on Samantha's debit card and had instructions to deposit the money into the account. This gave officers and the FBI investigators a way to potentially capture the kidnapper if he used the debit card to take the money out. At the FBI's request, James deposited $5,000 from the reward money fund into the account. The FBI thought it would be best not to put the entire demand, hoping that it would frustrate the kidnapper and force him to reach out again. 4 hours after the ransom money was deposited, someone tried to withdraw $600 from an ATM in Anchorage. Then the person began to go from ATM to ATM to withdraw the maximum daily amount, totaling more than $1,000 on the first night. It took several days for the images from the ATM machines to come back from FBI experts, and the experts determined that the man had an athletic frame. He was wearing a dark hoodie with white paint splattered on the front. Another key piece of information was that the expert believed that the suspect was likely a Marine based on a logo on one of his hoodies. Samantha had been missing for a month by the time the officers and the FBI had a vague description of the suspect and had been able to confirm that they were still in Anchorage. However, on March 7th, they got an unexpected call. The debit card had been used to withdraw $400 in Willcox, Arizona. The kidnapper had left the state. An hour later, there was another withdrawal on the debit card, this time in Lordsburg, New Mexico. Again, he attempted to withdraw more than the daily limit. Then at the same ATM, the suspect used the debit card again, this time to check the balance in the account, $3,598.91. He withdrew another $80 to get as close as he could to the daily $500 limit. The kidnapper had used a smaller bank chain, one that didn't use a sophisticated surveillance system. It took the FBI 2 days to get images, which confirmed it was likely the same suspect that had made the withdrawals in Anchorage. A tall, Caucasian man wearing bulky, excessive layers in an attempt to hide his frame. He wore a hat, sunglasses, and a face mask with jeans and white tennis shoes. Officers were concerned that the suspect had left Alaska. It didn't bode well for Samantha. Officers were unsure if she was with him or if she was still in Alaska. Were there more than one kidnapper? Did they take her across the border? And why were they still risking capture by using her debit card? Local police, all FBI offices in the area, and Texas Rangers were all distributed a Be on the Lookout bolo flyer with Samantha's picture and the blurry image from the suspect from the ATMs, and the car that could be seen in the back of the ATM photos, likely a rental. The Texas Rangers are a state police agency famous for tracking down Bonnie and Clyde. They specialize in criminal and special investigations such as apprehending wanted felons, suppressing significant disturbances, and assisting smaller local law enforcement agencies. They didn't have a lot to go on. They were looking for a white male driving a white rental car from Alaska and in possession of a debit card from a missing girl. He seemed to be traveling eastbound on the I-10 highway. The card had been used most recently on March 12th in Shepherd, Texas. It had been used at 2:47 a.m., and the FBI were able to determine, based on the shape of the windshield, that the suspect was driving an older model white Ford Focus. Bolo flyers were distributed to Texas Highway Patrol officers, and there was another ATM withdrawal in Humboldt, Texas. And on March 13th, Texas Ranger Stephen Rayburn was patrolling local hotel and motel parking lots when around 11 a.m. he spotted a white rental outside of a Quality Inn in Lufkin, Texas. They decided to send an officer to stake out the vehicle and get a look at the driver. By 11:30, the ranger saw a tall white male begin to pack the Ford Focus and get into it. By now, the Anchorage PD and the FBI were all patched in and waiting on law enforcement in Texas to keep them updated. The suspect exceeded the local speed limit by 2 kilometers per hour and allowed the officer to pull the driver over. The suspect calmly pulled over and stopped in a cafe parking lot. The officer asked for his license and registration and was shocked when he handed over an Alaskan driver's license. The name on the license was Israel Keyes. Backup was called and the Texas Highway Patrol officer Brian Henry joined Rayburn. Keyes was in his mid-30s. He was wearing wraparound sunglasses and a white tank top with jeans. Without being asked, Keyes told Rayburn that he was in town for his sister's wedding and was sharing a room with his brother. Keyes asked why he was pulled over and was told that they were looking into a kidnapping that had occurred in Alaska. The officer ran his license number and noted his address was listed in Anchorage. He also stated that Keyes had no criminal record, no warrants, or even a speeding ticket. The officers indicated that Keyes was beginning to display nervous physical cues. He was also rambling and offering up information about his recent whereabouts, unsolicited. Keyes was asked when he arrived in Texas and how he got there. He said he came in on Thursday and said that he'd flown from Anchorage to Las Vegas and had driven from there to Texas. He mentioned his daughter, and officers asked where she was. They had noted clothing in the car that looked like it belonged to a little girl. He said that she was with his brother in Wells, Texas. Officers asked to search Keyes' wallet and car, and his demeanor changed to aggravated. From what officers could see from outside the car, there were white sneakers matching what the suspect had been wearing in the ATM surveillance, as well as several paper maps and rolls of cash in the passenger side door with red dye on it. Keyes was no longer cooperating with officers, and they had to make the decision to arrest him or let him go. Texas has looser probable cause laws. If an officer suspects that a vehicle has been used in connection with a crime, it's up to the officer's discretion to search it. However, they also had to take into consideration Alaskan law, as any trial would take place there, and they couldn't risk having potential key evidence being dismissed in an unlawful search. Officers in Alaska decided to allow the search. Israel Keyes was arrested, which gave Texas officers authority to search for what they wanted. They were looking for Samantha's debit card, and upon opening Keyes' wallet, they found the card with the pin etched into the plastic on the card. At this point, there were 5 officers on the scene, and one was documenting the car's contents. They located several hoodies and jackets in the trunk, as well as a face mask similar to the one seen in the ATM image, gloves, a cell phone with the battery and SIM card removed, a gun, and a black ski mask. They got him.
He was arrested in Texas in March after withdrawing money from Koenig's bank account, ending his cross-country killing spree.
We're jumping here, and the first thing I got to tell you, Israel, we talked about a little bit earlier, that stunt yesterday in the courtroom did not go over well.
With who?
Well, with a lot of folks, not the least of which were the prosecutors. And that was the delay actually in here is we knew you had some legal questions, and so we reached out for him to say, hey, Israel says he's got some questions. Are you guys available to speak to him? And I couldn't even get one. One of them was in court, and the other one said, basically, what the fuck, after yesterday. So they didn't think that was too funny.
Why are they afraid I'd actually get away? That would be embarrassing for them, I guess.
No, it's...
Israel Keyes didn't have a criminal record, which was surprising. Usually, perpetrators of this magnitude had a lengthy criminal history that showed an escalation in criminal activity. Keyes barely existed on paper. Much of what we know about Keyes is from his own interrogations, his interviews with his mother, and journals recovered from his home. Keyes had all the markers of a psychopath, and he understood from a young age that he wasn't like everyone else, and had to hide his true nature to blend in with his peers.
They know they're going to tell you something that does not line up with anything I tell you because I'm 2 different people, basically. And the only person who knows about what I'm telling you, the kind of things I'm telling you, is me.
How long have you been 2 different people?
Long time. 14 years.
It was important for the FBI to learn as much as they could about Israel Keyes. Like many other serial killers, they wanted to understand the key influences in his life that led him to become such a dangerous man. Asking the question asked for decades, are serial killers born, or are they made the way they are? Keyes was born on January 7th in 1978 in Cove, Utah. He was the second of 10 children of his parents, Heidi and John Jeffrey, who went by Jeff Keyes. His parents had met as teenagers in Los Angeles, California, and were fervently anti-government. His parents were both societal misfits and could never seem to find where they belonged. They had both been raised Mormons and had deeply instilled religious beliefs. They were married when Heidi was 21 and Jeff was 22. They wanted to raise their children in nature. They moved to Utah, where they had their first child at home birth. Heidi would give birth to all of her children without any assistance from hospitals. Neither she nor her husband believed in modern medicine. They also didn't want the government to interfere with their lives, and there was too much paperwork with hospitals, birth certificates, immunizations, social security numbers, medical records, were not something Jeff wanted his family involved with. While in Utah, they were visited by government officials who had concerns about the children. They packed up and moved to Colville, Washington, where they purchased 160 acres of rural property. Israel, along with all his siblings, were homeschooled in a 1-bedroom cabin. They grew up without heat, running water, or electricity for most of their childhood. Jeff worked in the area as a handyman, appliance repair technician, and also did construction. Heidi stayed home with the children. On the Colville property, Jeff was slowly constructing a permanent home for the family by himself. Mainly using resources found on the land, Heidi recalled her husband's religious beliefs to be extreme. Their children were raised with no interference from the outside world, not even a radio. They also had few friends and only interacted with other children within their church. Eventually they left their Mormon church and instead became fundamentalist Christians. Their new church, the Ark, had extreme white supremacist ideologies, which Keyes himself recognized as impacting his formative years. Though he knew from a young age, he didn't have the same religious beliefs as his parents. The Keyes children grew up in extreme poverty. Israel had physical deformities in his toes from wearing shoes that were too small for his feet for many years. They ate what was grown and hunted on the property, and their injuries were treated at home, no matter how serious. Israel was the oldest son, and when Jeff wasn't home, he was the man of the house. He often was responsible for his younger siblings, more than both of his parents. The Keyes believed their way of life made them superior to others. They didn't rely on technology, capitalism, or anyone else to help raise their family. They were proof that the old way of life worked, and they had 10 healthy children to attest to it. But it wasn't a perfect life. In winter, Heidi would take the children to her aunt's house in Palm Springs to keep them warm. In their new church, Israel was exposed to guns and took a keen interest. He became interested in learning everything he could about how they worked, which ones were banned, and how to acquire prohibited weapons. In his teens, he began breaking into homes and stealing guns. He would then resell them as a way of making money. Israel also said that occasionally he would break into a home and just move things around, then wait in the woods to watch the homeowners come home and freak out. He described this as an entertaining activity. At 14, he started to get bored with breaking into homes and escalated to torturing animals. This was also when he began to hide his sadistic behaviors, as he discovered that his friends were appalled by this behavior. His friends had told their parents, who in turn told Israel's parents, and he didn't like that. When talking about his past, Keyes stopped being forthcoming with his escalating violent behavior. When asked directly if he hurt anyone during his childhood, he deflected, indicating that he likely had sexual or physical assault victims beginning as early as childhood. When he was 15, he started the construction of his own cabin a mile away from the family's construction, and when he finished a year later, he moved into it. Israel also at this time started working on a construction company with other members of the Ark. Once Israel began living alone, separated from his family, he became obsessed with hunting. Through hunting, he honed his patience and learned to stay still for hours at a time. He also honed in on tracking and relying on all his senses to become a stealthy predator.
When I was smart, I would let them come to me. Just remote area. You go to a remote area that's not anywhere near where you live, but that other people go to as well.
He said that while he was practicing his stealth and camouflage, he would stumble upon people on these hunting trips, hikers, other hunters, or just people on their properties, and he would try to get as close as possible without them noticing. He would visualize killing and hiding their bodies. When he was as young as 13, he knew he had urges to kill. He was caught shoplifting when he was 16, and his parents searched his cabin and found a cache of stolen weapons. They forced him back into the family home, where he could be kept close. Heidi said that she could see that he was separating himself from the church and was more defiant at home. He was rebelling against Jeff and the constraints he imposed on the family. When Israel told his parents that he didn't believe in God or organized religion, Jeff exploded. He disowned Israel and kicked him out. Though Heidi didn't share the same sentiments as her husband, and she kept in contact with Israel, she loved her son no matter what he believed in. In 1996, Jeff decided to move the family to Oregon. Israel had been reluctant to join the family, but did in order to help support his mother and his siblings. In Oregon, he helped his father build houses to sell. In 1997, Jeff again picked up the family for reasons unknown and relocated them to Smyrna, Maine. There, they joined an Amish community. Jeff purchased a property in Malone, New York, and signed the deed over to Israel. Israel didn't live with the family while they lived with the Amish. He didn't believe in the Amish lifestyle and felt it was silly. He had enough with living off-grid and being dragged from one extreme religion to the next. Israel had been forced to leave behind a girlfriend back in Colville and expressed deep regret and heartbreak for leaving her. In his journals, he had mixed feelings about leaving his family, but ultimately decided he wanted to live his own life. Israel got his GED, and in 1996, at 20 years old, he enlisted in the military. What was most odd about his enlistment was that Keyes didn't have a birth certificate or social security number. Technically, he didn't exist on paper, according to the US government. He had told people he had grown up Amish as an easier way of explaining why he didn't understand sports references or pop culture, or many things that normal people experienced. Keyes himself admitted that he enjoyed his life in the military. The structure and organization were a welcome change from his chaotic childhood, and he said he was a good soldier. He was an infantryman stationed at Fort Hood in Texas. While in the Army, he began to experiment with drugs and alcohol. He would use cocaine heavily and go on weekend-long benders, but always be able to sober up in time for duty, and only a few knew the extent of his substance abuse. He admitted to blacking out several times, but had learned to control and keep his growing alcoholism in check around his family. In the Army, he had continued a long-distance relationship with his girlfriend back in Colville, but had also been dating a woman near the base in Washington. He had been engaged to the Colville girl at one point, but she could tell things had changed in their relationship. Eventually, he called off their wedding and said he had been seeing someone at the base. The woman's name was Tammy. She was 10 years older than Israel, and it started as a casual relationship until Tammy got pregnant. He was arrested and charged with a DUI by the military police and honorably discharged in 2001. When he left the Army, he settled down in Nia Bay, Washington with Tammy. Tammy and Keyes got along well. They both had traumatic childhoods and bonded over their unusual upbringing. Tammy was half Indigenous and half African American and lived on the Makah Reservation, where Keyes moved in with her. Keyes liked that Tammy didn't give him a hard time. She never questioned when he came home late or talked to other women. In Nia Bay, he would go on trips for days or weeks at a time. He was hired as a parks and recreation worker on the reservation, and when his daughter was born, he was a devoted father. He loved children, having helped raise most of his younger siblings, and he was an excellent caregiver. Tammy also had an 8-year-old son from a previous relationship, and Keyes took over as a parental figure when he moved in with Tammy. 2 weeks after his daughter's birth, Israel's father died. He left to attend the funeral in Maine and was gone for over a week. During that time, Tammy had little communication with him. There were no records of a funeral for Jeff Keyes. There was also no death certificate or any record at any funeral home or cemetery. Investigators learned that while the family had been relocating again, Jeff had gotten very ill due to an ongoing thyroid condition that had never been treated, and he died somewhere along that trip. Tammy noted that in their time together, she couldn't remember a time when Israel went into detail about his childhood experiences. They were always broad and vague. He also said that when he drank, he sometimes would say things that didn't make sense to her. Once he said he was a bad person and that she didn't know him, and he had a black heart. She brushed it off as leftover trauma from his childhood. It was also during that time that he had an upside-down cross branded on his chest and got a pentagram tattooed on the back of his neck. She felt that he was rebelling against his religious upbringing and didn't think much about it at the time. In 2003, the couple separated and they shared custody of their daughter. Israel went on to date several women until he met Kimberly while she was working as a nurse in Port Angeles. And when Keyes was 29, he moved to Anchorage with Kimberly, and he shared custody of his daughter with Tammy. In 2007, he also started his construction business in Alaska. In his relationship with Kimberly, he began taking long trips alone. He would fly into a state, rent a car, and put thousands of miles on the rental. He also started taking trips down to Tijuana, where he would get unknown medical procedures. One of those procedures was a nose job, and he also had dental work done, as can be seen in photographs. He simply wrote in his journals, medical procedure, but it was also speculated that he may have had Botox to reduce sweat and laser hair removal. Investigators noticed early on that he was extremely nervous about leaving DNA evidence behind on his victims, and it had been a point of pride that they never found any linking him to any crimes. What also shocked me was his travels to Victoria, British Columbia. He was here on April 22, 2006 for an overnight trip where he also rented a boat. There were no missing person cases during the time that Keyes was in town, but he traveled to Canada fairly often. Keyes generally traveled paying with cash when he could. He would also take the battery and SIM card out of his phones, though there were still border crossings, hotel reservations, and car rentals where he needed to give credit card information, though sometimes those bookings would be under Kimberly's card.
The FBI releases interviews and a timeline of events of confessed serial killer Israel Keyes in hopes of identifying his homicide victims. I'm Molly Halpern of the Bureau, and this is Wanted by the FBI. Investigators say Israel Keyes, who took his own life in jail, committed 11 homicides across the country between 2001 and 2012. Case agent Jolene Godin says investigators have identified 3 victims.
It's really important to us to be able to bring some type of closure to family members that are still wondering what happened to their loved ones.
Keyes also admitted to multiple kidnappings, bank robberies, home invasions, and arsons. He told investigators he buried caches of money, tools, and weapons across the country to help him commit his crimes.
Our primary concern is identifying additional homicide victims, but we're certainly also interested in identifying other crimes that he committed because it will help us put him in a particular place in the country.
Keyes told FBI agents he related the most with convicted serial killer Ted Bundy.
He didn't really have remorse, he didn't have empathy.
Visit FBI.gov for details of Keyes' travels and interviews. Report tips to 1-800-CALL-FBI.
That is where we are going to end this part. In the next one, we're going to go over his arrest, interrogation, and confessions. As always, please give this video a thumbs up if you like the content and subscribe for more if you haven't already. If you've done all that and want to support me and the channel, we have channel membership as well as Patreon to get early access, members only content, and more. We also have merch and other goodies in the description box and links to all my socials. But until then, I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now. Upon Israel's arrest, he initially was held in Texas until he was extradited back to Anchorage, a legal process that took 2 weeks. FBI agents took over the investigation, which initially had the primary focus of locating Samantha Koenig, who at this point had been missing for over 2 months. While Israel was still in Texas, the FBI raided and tore through the house he shared with his girlfriend Kimberly. They seized electronic devices, Keyes' vehicle, journals, and searched for any clues of Samantha. Kimberly was initially uncooperative with officers, believing Keyes was innocent. After his arrest, his mother and Tammy were both interviewed, and officers were intrigued that neither of those women were surprised or shocked by the allegations. They were both fully cooperative with law enforcement. His mother, Heidi, revealed that while Israel had been in Texas, he was acting very odd. She said that he had been unusually emotional and agitated. She said that he had also visited her on February 13th, 2 weeks after Samantha's disappearance, and she said that that visit had also been odd. She said that he had snuck out in the middle of the night, leaving a note in his room, "Gone to fix the window and find a place to hide my guns." Heidi had said that wasn't entirely unusual behavior, and at the time it made rational sense. Israel liked guns, and the windshield on his rental car had cracked on his drive up. He had left his daughter with Heidi and only answered messages sporadically, but had been gone for 2 nights. On the 3rd day, he said that he was stranded in another town an hour away from where he had left. When they found him, he was disheveled, he and the car were covered in mud, and Israel was acting completely out of character. He was talking a mile a minute, with a litany of excuses, attempting to explain where he'd been for 2 days. He normally was calm, cool, and collected, but that wasn't what was happening now. They went back to Heidi's home, and again Israel disappeared several more times. No one asked Israel to explain any further, and he didn't provide any details of where he had been. Heidi mentioned that she'd noticed Israel had been drinking heavily, much more than she'd seen in years past. He was also willing to talk to her church's elders, which was also notable since he had taken such a strong stance of anti-religion in the past. Right before his flights back to Anchorage, he gave Heidi $900 in cash to pay her back. Then he and his daughter flew back to Alaska on the 18th. Once Keyes was back in Anchorage after his extradition, he told officers he wanted to talk. Keyes was realistic about his circumstances and told officers that if his demands were met, he was an open book. Initially, his demands were that the death penalty would be off the table and that he wanted what he was going to tell officers to stay out of the media. He didn't want his crimes to impact his family, particularly his young daughter. He didn't want his daughter to Google his name and have his crimes attached to him.
Really big concern to me is, my kid's going to be around. I don't want her to, type my name in the computer and have it pop up.
At the time of his arrest, the FBI had very little to tie him to Samantha's disappearance. All they had was the fraudulent use of a credit card. Though in their first interview with Keyes, it was clear that he believed they had a lot more information on him, and the FBI had to keep up that belief. They decided to go through the evidence in chronological order. They showed Keyes photos from the ATMs, clothing from the rentals that matched the photos, Samantha's debit card in his wallet as well as her cell phone, along with disturbing material on his computer's hard drive. They had also revealed that they had already interviewed Heidi and Tammy, threatening to release embarrassing details about his life to the press. In the first interview with Keyes, he opened up right away and began with the events on February 1st, when he kidnapped Samantha. He said that he had selected the Common Grounds coffee stand because it was open later than the other cafes, and he could see only one girl closing most nights. He had picked February 1st because there was a festival on the other side of town, and most police officers and residents would be there. He had observed the kiosk for several evenings to get a sense of the routine. Initially, he had only planned to rob the coffee stand. He said that he had never met or knew Samantha prior to abducting her. He had waited in his truck until it was close to closing before he went up to the kiosk. He noticed that the girl on shift didn't have a vehicle, as there wasn't one in the parking lot. He wore a ski mask as well as a police scanner in his ear and ordered a coffee. Samantha made the drink, an Americano, and handed it back to him. He made sure to examine the coffee stand carefully, confirming that she was alone. That was when he pulled out a gun and demanded her to hand over the money in the cash register. He directed her to turn the lights off, then told her to get the money from the cash register. Samantha had told him that her father was on the way to bring her dinner, but slipped up, first saying he would be there in half an hour, then correcting to say he was on the way. At that moment, Keyes decided to kidnap Samantha. He said it hadn't been planned, and it was a spur-of-the-moment decision, based on the adrenaline rush from the robbery. Though it went against his rule, don't commit crimes where you live. He lifted himself into the kiosk window and told Samantha to get down. He warned her to not cause any trouble, and he told her he had an earpiece connected to a police scanner, so he would know if anything was to go down. He told her he was going to kidnap her for ransom, saying to her, "I don't want to hurt you, but this .22 is loaded with very quiet ammo. It will kill you, so don't make me do it." He bound her hands behind her using zip ties. He closed and locked the kiosk windows, and took a stack of napkins and stuffed them in Samantha's mouth. He led Samantha out of the kiosk and towards his truck, but as Keyes hadn't planned on taking a victim or using his personal vehicle, he needed to clear the passenger seat off. For hours he drove her around in his truck. He said that he explained what was going to happen with the ransom. He said that he tried to keep her calm, and he was trying to act like a normal person, implying that he knew he wasn't a normal person, and he had likely done this before. At one point, he even had to return to the coffee stand to retrieve Samantha's car keys and phone so he could send a message to her boss and her boyfriend Dwayne. Around 2 a.m., he brought her back to the shed in his backyard. His daughter and girlfriend were asleep in the house. He was leaving for a pre-planned trip later that morning. He knew he would need to get his daughter up in a couple hours, and he'd already ordered a cab to take him to the airport at 5 a.m. He went back to the shed and spoke to the now-tied Samantha and turned on a radio, blasting heavy metal music. "I'll make you comfortable," he told her. "You just sit here, but I'm gonna have this police scanner on me, So if I hear reports of screaming from this neighborhood or anything, any disturbance from over here, I'm gonna be back here before the cops. He asked where her debit or credit card was. She said that she shared a bank account with her boyfriend and the debit card was in their truck. He got her home address and got back to the truck and then got back in his vehicle to retrieve it. That was when he had that encounter with Dwayne on the back porch. But he was able to get the card. He went back to the shed and got the pin from Samantha, which he carved into the card. With 5 a.m. quickly approaching, he sexually assaulted Samantha, strangled her, and then locked the shed up, showered, got changed. He then went back to the shed, rolled her body into a tarp, and hid her in a cupboard in the shed. He double-locked the shed, then he left for Alaska for his cruise. Investigators asked him, "Was she alive when you left?" Keyes said, "That would seem like an obvious question." So she was alive? Keyes then said, "When I left? No." Keyes was asked if he was concerned about leaving Samantha's body in his shed while he went away. He said he wasn't concerned. He was confident that they would never be able to tie him to her abduction. He said that he'd been listening to the police scanners, and based on what he heard, he knew that the Anchorage police were already facing dead ends. Keyes decided to make some additional demands before he gave investigators more information. He wanted them to stop questioning Kimberly, as he insisted she never had anything to do with his crimes. He also wanted officers to stop searching their home. He would give them what they needed, but the random searches needed to end, and they would need to get his permission to search. "I don't want to hear about you questioning her again," Keyes told agents.
There is no one who knows me, or who has ever known me, who knows anything about me, really. They're going to tell you something that does not line up with anything I tell you because I'm two different people, basically. And the only person who knows about the kind of things I'm telling you is me.
How long have you been two different people?
Long time. 14 years.
Keyes said that he returned on February 18th. He said that he had continued to check the weather in Anchorage. When his daughter went to school on Monday, February 22nd, he began to dismantle the shed, working from the inside first. He was burning wood from the shed and working around the cupboard containing Samantha's body. He also burned his clothing and shoes he had worn, as well as her purse, keeping only the cell phone and debit card. Once he had made more space inside the shed, he got her body out of the cupboard to prepare for his next move. Samantha's body had been mostly unchanged at the time due to the cold preserving the body. He purchased a bunch of makeup and decided to try and take a photo to show proof of life for the ransom. The newspaper he had used was from February 13th, a day he chose specifically because it was a day when he wasn't in Anchorage. He applied the makeup, but wasn't enough to make her look lively. He used fishing line to sew her eyes open, along with clear tape to make her look like she had life. He braided her hair and propped up her body, and took a photo using a Polaroid camera. He then also admitted to defiling her body. The ransom note was typed up using a manual typewriter he got at the Goodwill, and he photocopied the Polaroid to make it an even lower quality photograph. He then placed the ransom note on the bulletin board and used Samantha's cell phone to send the text message. He said that he had decided on the $30,000 because that was how much had been raised by Samantha's father. When he sent the text using Samantha's phone, he said that he had parked nearby the ransom note and waited for officers to arrive. He watched agents, a CSI van, and officers investigate the scene. He watched them for a while before going home. Agents said that while Keyes had been retelling the events of Samantha's murder, Keyes would go into a trance-like state, reliving the events with guilt, shame, but also excitement. While in his trance, he went into detail and included his thought process behind his decisions. He seemed relieved to talk to someone about it, and the agents knew it was imperative to not act shocked or disgusted despite their feelings to the contrary. The more comfortable Keyes was, the more information could be gained with his trust. He revealed the location of Samantha's body. He had dismembered the body over the course of several days. He would pack out storage bins with parts and dump it into the Matanuska Lake. an hour away from Anchorage, using an ice fishing shed he had already built. He thought dumping the body over several trips would be unsuspicious, as it was common for ice fishers to bring a few things with them. He even recounted seeing other people at the lake. He said that he had struggled to use a chainsaw to cut a hole through the ice, and remembered another fisherman looking at him quizzically, wondering why he didn't ask to use his ice drill. He said that he weighed the remains, and once the body was completely disposed of, he dismantled the fishing shack and tried to hide as much evidence as possible, though he wasn't able to get rid of everything before he was called about his sister's wedding in Texas. Samantha's body was recovered by specialized divers on April 2nd, 2012, a tragic end to those who had hoped for a different ending. With Keyes' confession, the FBI now had evidence needed to charge Israel Keyes with the murder of Samantha Koenig. It also opened up the door for Keyes to talk about his other crimes that the FBI had no idea about. Though they had a hunch that Keyes had done this before, they had no evidence to connect him. It was now up to FBI officials to get as much information as possible out of Israel Keyes. Where we left off, Samantha Koenig's body had been recovered, and the interrogations with Keyes would continue. A few FBI agents had built a rapport with Keyes, and they continued to bluff that the FBI knew more than they did, with Keyes himself saying, "I've got a lot more stories to tell." The FBI had to comb through years of cell phone records, multiple computer hard drives, travel records, and bank history going back several years, attempting to piece together an account of his travels. Keyes' computer revealed hundreds of pictures, some of them attached to news articles, and most of them were missing persons, all of varying age, gender, race, from a variety of demographics. All or none could be potential victims, but the photos included a familiar face, Samantha Koenig. There were hundreds of photos. The FBI sifted through the photos, attempting to identify all of them. When Keyes was asked if he thought he was a serial killer, he said yes. While talking to the FBI, Keyes had implied several times that there were more victims. He used that as bargaining chips to get his demands met, and they did get met because the FBI needed him to admit or hint to some sort of crime. At one point, Keyes needed help firing his attorney, but he wouldn't say why, but it gave the FBI leverage. A victim in exchange for assistance navigating the process of representing himself. On April 6, 2012, Keyes set up a meeting for his confession, without a lawyer and representing himself. In that meeting, he made a new demand. He wanted to be given the death penalty, and he wanted it in 1 year. He revealed that he had wanted his lawyer fired because his lawyer was against the death penalty.
I want an execution date.
For you?
Yes. I want this whole thing wrapped up and over with as soon as possible.
Keyes did not want to spend the rest of his life in a max security federal detention center. He also wanted the media attention minimized. He said both reasons were for his daughter. He wanted her to live a life away from his crimes, and he wanted her to have a normal life.
Really big concern to me is, my kid's going to be around. I don't want her to type my name in the computer and have it pop up.
I want my kid to have a chance to grow up and not have all this hanging over her head.
The FBI wasn't in a position to make those promises, but said that they would need another victim in order to get the ball rolling. Keyes agreed, though he said he would only confess to the crimes he knew that they could connect him to, either from DNA or from the contents of his computer. He asked to be brought a map of Vermont. In early June 2011, Keyes had flown from Anchorage to Chicago. He rented a vehicle and drove out east. He had flown out with the intention of murdering, though he didn't know who. He had pre-chosen the place, Essex, Vermont, as he had already buried a cache of weapons, tools, zip ties, Drano, and other items several years previous in an orange Home Depot bucket. He called it a kill kit and revealed he had several of them buried in remote areas around the country. He said it was for convenience, The caches made it easier to travel through airlines, and he thought it would make it harder to track. It was an elaborate system he had developed several years prior to his arrest. On June 7th, Keyes arrived in Essex and booked a hotel. He had gotten a 3-day fishing license and went fishing a few times. He said that he would drive around the different neighborhoods looking for a target. Keyes said, "I decided I was going to look for a house with a couple in it. I was looking for a fairly easy way to get into the garage, and theirs was the first house I found that had all those things." It was after midnight when he found the house that he thought would be best. It was a single-story ranch-style home. He crept around their backyard, peering into their windows. He noted there was no sign of children or pets, and that the couple were likely older.
I think I even had it pegged down just from looking at the outside because of the way they had their backyard set up. It just looked like an older couple that didn't have kids kind of house.
The home belonged to retired couple Bill and Lorraine Currier. He staked out the home for hours, waiting in a wooded area. He had noticed a neighbor that kept coming in and out of his home smoking. Keyes needed to wait until the man finally went to bed, as he didn't want to have any witnesses. He wore all black, including a face mask and leather gloves, but he also had on a headlamp. He entered the home via a ventilation fan in the garage. Once he had access to the garage, he was able to enter the home by breaking a glass window pane in their door. He crept through the home undetected and confirmed there was a couple inside. He woke up Bill and Lorraine and zip-tied them. He said that they awoke dazed and confused, and he barraged them with questions, asking for locations of their valuables, prescription drugs, weapons, and cash. He said that at one point Lorraine had fought back, attempting to escape. He said that he became enraged by this. He didn't like that they weren't taking him seriously. He said that he was mad that they didn't understand who was in control in this situation. While he was searching the house, he noticed that Bill had a military insignia. He had realized that Bill had served in the same infantry unit he had served in, the 25th Infantry Division. He had exploited that information to manipulate Bill and keep him calm. He convinced the couple that he was only looking for drugs and money and wouldn't hurt them. Then he packed the couple into the backseat of their car and drove them to an abandoned house outside of Essex. At the house, he separated Bill and Lorraine. While trying to immobilize the couple in separate areas of the house, he lost control. Bill had gotten free of his bindings, and in a panic, Keyes shot Bill using a silenced handgun. Bill had fought to the very end. He tortured and sexually assaulted Lorraine before strangling her with a rope. Keyes had said that after the couple had been murdered, he poured Drano on their hands and faces and put their bodies in large industrial garbage bags. He then moved them to a corner of the basement and piled garbage, broken furniture, and wood on top. By the time Keyes was finished, the sun was already up and the morning commute had begun. Originally, he had planned on setting fire to the home, but it was too late. There was too much traffic and too much of a risk of the house not becoming fully engulfed before someone reported it, and then a fire investigation would reveal the bodies. Keyes said that he had rushed out of the house and left evidence behind, which had included the shells from his bullets, which was why he was certain the FBI would be able to connect him to the crimes. He felt that it might not be now, but they would eventually. The house the Curriers had been murdered in was vacant and condemned to be demolished. Keyes had no idea at the time that he had confessed, but the house had been torn down with the bodies inside. The demolition company was none the wiser, and all materials from the old home were disposed of at the local landfill. Despite an extensive search, the bodies of the Curriers were never found. The Curriers had been reported missing the following day. Their home had provided little evidence, and their car was located abandoned in a strip mall parking lot. A witness had come forward having seen a white male with long brown hair driving the Curriers' car. Keyes hadn't been worried, though, as the sketch bore little resemblance to him. The FBI had noticed that Keyes was revealing an MO, similarities between the Curriers and Samantha's murder. Abduction to a secondary location, restraining with rope, death by strangulation, sexual assault. He also planned his crimes around family events with tight timelines. By doing so, it gave him a strong alibi. It also gave him a reasonable explanation for his travels. Weddings, funerals, visiting his mother were easy to explain. He would be able to dismiss any questions about his complicated travel arrangements by explaining it was cost-effective. In his confessions, Keyes revealed that he would rob banks during his travels, always smaller bank chains with less security. The robberies were more of a necessity, as he had racked up a lot of credit card debt and needed cash, but he admitted to enjoying the adrenaline rush. At the time of his arrest, it was already clear he had robbed at least one bank because of the marked cash in the car. He had revealed he was going too fast and a dye pack had exploded. He revealed that he had robbed that bank during the time that his mother had said he had gone missing. His computers revealed he spent a lot of time researching small towns that saw little crime and would have inexperienced law enforcement. He would note the towns on his maps and pre-plan places to rob while he was traveling. His computers also showed that Keyes spent a lot of time researching abandoned properties and remote churches. During his interrogations, he had been asked why he had looked at so many remote churches in Vermont, and he said he wanted to bring potential victims to a church for personal reasons, which investigators believed had a lot to do with his upbringing. Murdering and hiding bodies were no longer enough of a thrill for Keyes. He expressed a desire to have more media attention. He wanted infamy. Samantha's death had changed things for Keyes. His search history on his computer revealed that he read about it over and over and over. He even participated in online forum discussions and witnessed the pain firsthand that he had inflicted on the community. He had planned future crimes to have more media attention. He had spent hours planning how he wanted his future crimes to play out. He admitted he was arrested before he could enact his new methods. However, he did try, but he found it difficult to find victims in Texas. He said that people in Texas were more suspicious of outsiders and were less likely to take their personal safety for granted. He had been deterred from abducting a woman when he noticed she had a large dog with her. He did admit to setting a house on fire in Aledo, Texas, in order to cause a distraction so he could rob a bank during the time that he had been unaccounted for. In total, Keyes sat for more than 40 hours of interviews with the FBI over the 8 months of his incarceration. During those interviews, he gave several clues to additional victims. He didn't give clues for free, though. He would exchange information for copies of the New York Times, access to the internet, cigars, Americanos, candy bars, and fast food.
I can give you the rest of the story, like, everything that happened, if I get a cigar.
We're going to go through some of those crimes he either alluded to or could potentially be linked based on interrogations and evidence found. The FBI believes his first murder victims were carried out when he was 18, when his family had moved from Colville, Washington, and there'd been about a month before Israel had joined them. Julie Marie Harris disappeared on March 3, 1996. She was 12 years old and was a Special Olympics athlete with 2 prosthetic feet. She vanished from Colville while waiting for a ride to church. Decades later, friends of Julie had been interviewed, and one of those friends said that she remembered seeing Israel Keyes. She said that she saw him having a conversation with Julie at the pool where she often swam. She said that Julie had given Keyes her address and phone number. Months after her disappearance, her prosthetics were found at the mouth of the Colville River, and her remains were found a year later. No forensic evidence was ever recovered in that case, and though Keyes said he wasn't involved, he admitted to knowing about the case and gave visual cues to investigators that indicated to them that there was more to the story. There was also another double murder in Colville around the same time. 12-year-old Cassie Emerson had been abducted on June 27, 1996. It was believed that she had been kidnapped from her trailer home, which had been destroyed by arson, and had also contained her deceased mother, Marlene Emerson. Cassie's body was discovered 5 miles away from her home in a wooded area near Logging Road. The similarities to Julie's murder tied the two crimes together, and it was believed they were committed by the same person. There were no other similar crimes in Colville or any area nearby after Israel moved from the area, and he had admitted to agents that the first time he committed arson, it was to a trailer home. The first crime that he admitted to was the sexual assault of a girl at the Deschutes River in Oregon in 1997 or 1998. At the time, he was living in the area in Maupin and was around 20 years old. He said that he'd been watching a group of teens floating down the river on inner tubes. He watched as one of the girls became separated from her friends. She was close to the shore, and he grabbed her and dragged her to an outhouse. He said that he had planned on killing her after he sexually assaulted her, but she kept talking to him, humanizing herself. And he said that he lost his nerve. That victim has never come forward, but FBI agents said it was her humanizing herself that had likely saved her life. She told him her name and just talked about anything and everything, trying to build a connection. She had also stayed calm during the entire thing, and Keyes had found that unsettling. He let her go, though he admitted it was one of his greatest regrets, as it plagued him for years. It was the only witness he had ever allowed to get away, and she'd seen his face.
She was talking to me and telling me, saying, "Oh, you're a good-looking guy. Why are you don't have to do this. I probably would have even gone out with you," and all this stuff. And things never got really violent like they could have if she had been fighting me or something. She was pretty smart. Because it worked. The main thing is I just lost my nerve right at the end.
He claimed his time in the military had kept him busy. However, when he was discharged from the Army, he started stalking and planning his next victim right away. He claimed to have committed at least 4 murders while he lived in Washington. The first was an unidentified couple in the early 2000s. He said he had murdered and buried their bodies somewhere in Washington, but he didn't disclose anything more than that. He had 2 additional murders in 2005 and 2006, though he wouldn't specify any further than that. They had been separate victims, and he revealed the location of where one of his victims could possibly be found, but relished that they would likely never find it. You guys know about Lake Crescent in Washington, right? I think that lake is about 500 to 700 feet deep. He had purchased a boat off of Tammy's ex-husband, and had used that boat to dispose of 1 or more of his victims. In 2006, Keyes' cell phone records had placed him in Washington, near where a high-profile murder had occurred near Pinnacle Lake on the Snohomish County Trail. A mother and daughter, Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden, had been hiking when they were both shot and killed on the trail. Their murder has never been solved and remains a mystery. Though there is no physical evidence to link Keyes to the murder, it fit his MO, and at the time of the murder, it was one of the times when Keyes' cell phone had been unable to track for several hours. Another one of Keyes' signatures. Over the years, he admitted to frequenting sex workers in the US, Canada, and Mexico. At his home in Anchorage, he had several phone numbers for people he liked to go out with. This was another trait he shared with several serial killers. Sex workers were potential victims. The vulnerabilities involved in their line of work make them a target for sexual sadists like Keyes, often serving as practice, knowing that missing person investigations were limited if they were even investigated at all. He said that he had another victim that he had abducted from the East Coast in 2009, then disposed of their body in upstate New York. Though Keyes himself didn't confirm, when he was shown a picture of the victim, he said, "I'm not ready to talk about that one," leading the FBI to strongly believe that 49-year-old Deborah Feldman is a confirmed victim. Deborah had gone missing from her home in New Jersey on April 8th. Her remains were never recovered. Keyes had said something about one of his victims being a woman with pale skin who possibly came from money, and agents were able to place him in Indiana at the time when a young woman had gone missing. It had been a high-profile missing persons case, and one that Keyes had searched on his computer multiple times. Lawrence Spear was 20 years old, a University of Indiana student, and had gone missing in the early morning hours on June 3rd in 2011. She had gone out with friends and was seen heavily intoxicated. She'd been seen on surveillance not wearing shoes, walking home around 4:30 a.m. She had left her cell phone and shoes at the bar and had dropped her purse and keys along the way. She never made it home and was never located. When Keyes was asked if he had anything to do with Lauren's disappearance, he didn't give a definitive answer. Without more evidence, it is unlikely that these cases will ever be tied back to Keyes officially. There is also no way of knowing for sure how many victims are out there. Based on his travels, cell phone records, potential evidence on his computer, the scope is just too wide. In addition to his time in the military and work as a park ranger, Keyes had also stated that he'd considered becoming a police officer. He felt that being a police officer would give him the perfect cover to hunt for victims. He imagined driving around at night and using the police lights to pull over victims, but ultimately decided being a self-employed contractor made more sense to him. In May of 2012, Keyes had attempted to escape court during a hearing. The FBI had wanted to move him to a more secure facility, but he couldn't get moved until he was charged and sentenced. They didn't feel that the correctional officers in Anchorage understood how dangerous Keyes was, both to himself and others. He was supposed to be monitored 24/7 with armed guards and frequent check-ins. He also wasn't allowed anything with a sharp edge or anything that could be a tool to harm himself. He had been given a pencil and had slowly worked to whittle it with his teeth into a lock-picking tool for his handcuffs and leg irons. He had been saving plastic wrap from his meals to make rope, and was also found to be saving all the pieces of dental floss he'd been given daily. It was the plastic wrap and the lead lockpicks that allowed him to get out of his cuffs and leg irons in court in May. Despite the warnings and this escape attempt, the Anchorage Corrections hadn't taken any of the necessary precautions the FBI had outlined, and it didn't change anything after. On December 1st, 2012, it was discovered that Keyes had committed suicide by cutting his wrists. He had managed to get a razor blade back to his cell and had been left unsupervised for several hours. A note had been found that consisted of an ode to murder letter, as well as 12 drawings. The drawings were in Keyes' own blood and were 11 skulls and 1 pentagram with the phrase, "We are one," written on the bottom. It could be a hint detailing how many victims he has in total, or it could be completely meaningless. There really is no way to know for sure. A lot of people look at how Israel Keyes was caught as a reflection of how he was as a criminal. The kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig had been his unraveling. No one really knows for sure what was going on, but multiple people had speculated that his drinking was out of hand, and they thought he was likely using harder substances. Many people in his life had noted that he was calm, collected, and always put together, but in 2012 they had noticed a different side of Keyes, one that was impulsive, erratic, and disorganized. Keyes even said about himself, "Back when I was smart," admitting that he even recognized something had changed.
Back when I was smart, I would do it. I would let them come to me.
Many serial killers want to be caught. They also want recognition and notoriety. He also said that his long-term girlfriend Kimberly's relationship had run its course. Like we see with many other serial killers, disruptions in the home or close relationships can set off a chain of events. We saw that with the Golden State Killer. His divorce had led to a months-long murder spree. Keyes went for years, possibly decades, with methodical, organized, and pre-planned crimes. He had buried weapon caches for years, keeping track of all of their locations for sometimes years only in his head, carrying out numerous crimes without leaving physical evidence. His elaborate traveling routes all using paper maps and keeping hours of research only in his mind. Up until 2012, he didn't make mistakes. We can only link crimes to him based on his travels. Many of his victims' bodies were never recovered. The FBI theorized that he would commit crimes in one state, bring them to a secondary location, potentially in another state, and dump their bodies in a third location. This is why he's considered one of the most dangerous, methodical, and chilling serial killers of his time.
Betty Newmar has been here at the Stanley County Jail for several weeks, held on a $500 million bond. And when her attorney asked today for that amount to be reduced, the prosecutor revealed some very strange things we did not know about the 76-year-old grandmother.
Dubbed in the media as the Black Widow Granny, Betty Newmar's arrest sparked a media frenzy. She looked like a harmless little grandma, but as investigators began to unravel Betty's life, with every stone unturned, it brought more questions than answers. She had been married at least 5 times and had used 28 different aliases throughout her life. She had numerous credit cards and passports with various names. Each of her husbands died under mysterious circumstances, usually a gunshot wound, and either Betty had the worst luck in the history of time, or she may have been the one to orchestrate that bad luck. She was born Betty Johnson in 1931 in Ironton, Ohio. Her early life was anything but glamorous, and she had been born into extreme poverty, and like many other young women in such circumstances at the time, her best chance to get out of poverty was to marry well. She graduated high school in 1949 and married her high school sweetheart, Clarence Malone, in 1950. He was a mechanic. Though the marriage was short-lived, in court documents, Betty claimed that Malone had been abusive, and it is believed that the couple separated in December of 1951. The couple had one child, Gary, who had been born 3 months after the couple had separated. Betty remarried shortly after she separated from her first husband, and her second husband, James Flynn, adopted Gary. There are no public records of Betty and James's marriage, and very little is known about the couple. They did have a child together, a daughter named Peggy, and their marriage would also be short, and this would be the first mysterious death to befall one of Betty's husbands. Betty claimed that he had died somewhere in New York in 1950. She told investigators that he had died on a pier and froze to death in his car. Betty relocated the family to Jacksonville, Florida, where she went by the name Betty Flynn. She enrolled in beauty college in 1960 and became a beautician. In Jacksonville, Betty, now in her early 30s, met and married Richard Sills. Sills was in the Navy. He had been recently divorced but hadn't kept in contact with his ex-wife or his son. Their marriage had also seemed to be rocky, and Peggy said that what she remembered most about her stepfather, Richard, was that he drank heavily and he liked vodka. She also remembered that he and Betty fought often. In 1965, the couple was arguing in their trailer home in Big Coppic Key, an island in the Florida Keys. The couple was in their bedroom arguing, with both of Betty's children in the other room. 11-year-old Peggy said that she remembered them arguing and hearing a gunshot go off. She said that she remembered going into the room to see what had happened and saw Richard lying on the bed and asking a paramedic if he was dead. Betty claimed that the couple had been arguing and Richard had been intoxicated and shot himself. The death was ruled a suicide, and because it had been ruled a suicide, all records pertaining to Richard's death were destroyed long before investigators had reopened the case. Local law enforcement didn't really handle the investigation into Richard's death. It in large part was left to the NCIS, the Naval Investigative Agency. Though there were some discrepancies between the two agencies, though there was not an autopsy conducted, the Florida medical examiner said it had been a single gunshot wound to the chest, while the NCIS had found there had been 2 wounds, one in the chest and one in the heart. Betty didn't inform Richard's son or ex-wife of his death. The military showed up at their home and informed them. When investigators opened up the investigation in 2009, it was too late. The statute of limitations in Florida had already expired, and Richard was never exhumed. 3 years after Richard Sill's death in 1967, she met Harold Gentry. Harold had been stationed in Florida and had met Betty while she was working as a hairdresser. The couple married less than a year later in January 1968, and they had a daughter, Kelly, a year later. Harold was in the Army, and for years the couple moved around a lot, and after 21 years in service, Harold decided to retire. They landed back in Harold's hometown in Norwood, North Carolina, and the couple built a home on land that had been gifted to them by Harold's sister. During her marriage to Harold, Betty's first husband, Clarence Malone, had died under mysterious circumstances. After his marriage to Betty, he had also remarried twice, and while at his car repair shop, he had been shot on November 27, 1970, in Medina, Ohio. It was a random drive-by shooting, and no one was ever arrested or a suspect in the murder. Harold and Betty seemed to live a very normal and loving marriage for many years. However, Harold's brother, Al Gentry, said that the marriage had been broken beyond repair after 18 years. He alleged that the couple had separated sometime in 1986 and that Betty had actually gone to live in Florida for several months. At that time, Harold had met another woman. Al said that Harold had told Betty he would be out of the house in 2 weeks, and then they could begin the process of divorce. Less than 2 weeks later, Harold had been shot 6 times as he'd been entering his home. At the time, it was believed that Harold had stumbled upon a robbery as the house had been ransacked. Al believes that Betty had hired someone to kill Harold. The police had actually called Al to come identify Harold's body at the scene, as Betty was 3 hours away in Augusta, Georgia. Al said that he knew that Betty had been involved when he said that she arrived on the scene, no tears, not upset, and without being asked, she said that she couldn't have been involved because she was in Augusta. There was no evidence or any suspects in Harold's murder, and the case quickly went cold. Officers also cleared Betty of any wrongdoing, and Betty moved on. After Harold's death, Betty, now in her 50s, she moved to Augusta, Georgia. There, she opened up a salon and continued doing hair. In 1985, Betty's first child, Gary, committed suicide. Gary's wife, Cecilia, claimed that Betty was not a nice person, and it was Betty who received Gary's $10,000 life insurance policy money. Cecilia had said that Gary had also witnessed Richard Sill's death, and the images had deeply traumatized him and even decades later still caused him significant pain. In 1990, Betty met John Newmar in her salon. He was a recent widow with 2 grown children and was looking for companionship. Betty was charming, and John was smitten with her. John's children were shocked when less than a year later they learned that their father was going to marry Betty, a woman that they barely knew. After the marriage in 1991, John's children said things began to change with their father. Their once loving, easygoing relationships turned cold and distant. A large wedge in that relationship came in 1995 when Betty had convinced John's son to invest $1,000 in a Ponzi scheme. She had also convinced 200 others to invest, saying that they would receive $100,000 for every $100 they invested. The money was funding legal expenses for a rich European family that had died without an heir, and the money would be distributed to everyone who funded these European lawyers. Long story short, there was no vast uninherited wealth, and it isn't clear how Betty was involved, but 7 people were arrested in connection to the Ponzi scheme, but Betty was not. Though something happened to John's money, because after a decade of marriage, the couple needed to file for bankruptcy in 2000 with over $200,000 in credit card debts. Prior to his marriage to Betty, John had owned his house outright, had multiple cars, and had a healthy retirement savings account. He had always been good with his money, and it was a life skill he had hammered into his children to save and not to live beyond their means. No one knows where the money went or how they got into such substantial credit card debt. They didn't appear to have spent it on themselves, it just seemed to be money that disappeared. In 2007, John began to get very ill, though he had been healthy his whole life. He was diagnosed with sepsis, but no one knew what was actually wrong with him that caused the sepsis. He started to deteriorate very quickly, and his children hadn't even known he had been sick. When he died soon after, at 76, Betty again didn't tell her deceased husband's children that their father had passed. John's son had been at work and was reading the newspaper when he saw his father's obituary. When he confronted Betty about his father, he learned that she'd had him cremated. This shocked his family, as John was Catholic, had never intended on being cremated, and had already purchased his funeral plot next to his first wife. The family went to the police and learned that John's cause of death had been determined to be natural causes, and there had not been an autopsy performed before his cremation. In 2007, Al Gentry was successful in getting his brother's cold case reopened in North Carolina, and the law enforcement agencies reached out to the Georgia authorities and had both Harold and John's deaths re-examined. A search warrant was issued and Betty's home was searched. During the search, they found several varieties of poisons, which included arsenic-based rat poisonings and a highly poisonous substance called carbon tetrachloride, the latter being very odd. The bottle had been found empty, and it is a liquid that is colorless with a mild sweet odor, and exposure to the chemical could cause liver and kidney failure, gastrointestinal and neurological symptoms, similar to what John had been experiencing prior to his death. His cremation remains were examined, and though they found evidence of heavy metals in the remains, it was a bust. John had been on several medications, and some of those medications could also account for the metals in his system. It had been too late to get a definitive conclusion. Betty was arrested in May 2008 and charged with solicitation to commit first-degree murder. According to her indictment, officers had found evidence that showed she had attempted to hire 3 different people to carry out the murder of Harold Gentry. She was 76 at the time of her arrest. She was initially held on a $500,000 bond. Officers believed that Betty had likely learned early on that murder was easier than divorce. However, though money may have been the motive, she didn't get much insurance money from her husband. She said in an interview, "I got no insurance from the first one, no insurance from the third one. After Harold died, I got $50,000, but as far as all this money and all this stuff goes, there wasn't none," in response to being accused of murdering for the insurance money. She had spent several months in jail, but was released after posting a $300,000 bail. Betty's daughters, Peggy and Kelly, believed her mother was innocent. Peggy said in a statement, "She has been a caring, loving mother, and she's a loving, caring grandmother. I think that she was just dealt a bad hand." Betty also maintained her innocence, and before she received a trial date, she died of cancer in 2011 at the age of 79. After her death, the states involved closed their cases, with so many mysteries surrounding Betty. Officers had hoped for a deathbed confession, but none came.
She has the face of a grandmother, but police say the mind of a killer. Chisako Kakehi, a 67-year-old Japanese millionaire with a long list of dead lovers.
In late 2013, 75-year-old Isao Kakehi and 67-year-old Chisako Kakehi were at the altar exchanging vows. Both of the Japanese seniors had been married before. This was Isao's second marriage and Chisako's fourth. They had met on a matchmaking website and married soon after. In an email to Isao, Chisako wrote, "I will stay with you for the rest of my life." But less than 2 months later, on December 28, 2013, Isao died suddenly. He had collapsed in their home in Muko, just outside of Kyoto, Japan. Chisako was reportedly inconsolable when police interviewed her, and they almost closed the case until the autopsy results came in. Autopsies aren't a normal occurrence in the death culture of Japan. They are generally only done at the request of police, and because Japan has such a low rate of crime, they're very rare. However, an officer had interviewed Chisako and discovered that she had been married 4 times and all of her husbands had died in similar manners, so the police officer made sure to look deeper into the matter. The post-mortem examination had uncovered a lethal dose of hydrochloric acid, also known as cyanide, in Mr. Kakehi's blood and stomach. Police started to suspect Chisako's involvement in her husband's death. They soon started to unravel Chisako's long history of murdered husbands and boyfriends, which spanned decades. Chisako Yamamoto was born on November 28, 1946, and was raised in Fukuoka, Japan. She had been a bright student and wanted to go to university, but her father wouldn't allow her due to his belief that women didn't need a higher education. She was a bank teller for many years and enjoyed working, but was forced to leave in 1969 when she met and married her first husband. Her new husband owned a successful fabric painting company. The couple had 2 children together, and her husband provided a comfortable life for the family. In 1994, her 54-year-old husband suffered a heart attack and was sent to hospital. He spent a few days there, and after recovering significantly, he was deemed fit to leave and was discharged. Though within days of him returning home, he died, and it was thought to have been related to his previous heart condition. After her husband's death, Chiseko took over her husband's company, but under her inexperienced leadership, the company collapsed. Less than a year later, Chiseko lost all of the wealth that her husband had accumulated and declared bankruptcy. In the bankruptcy, she lost the business and her home. An interesting fact about the fabric painting business: cyanide is used as a part of the commercial printing process. This led investigators to believe that this was how Chiseko was introduced to the poison and gave her unfettered access. In 2004, she met and married a pharmaceutical wholesaler who she met through a dating agency. 2 years later, he died from a stroke at the age of 69. She then married 75-year-old Toshiaki Yamamoto in 2008, who suffered a heart attack 3 months after their wedding. The couple had been at a restaurant and heading home when he collapsed in the street. He was rushed to hospital and was put on life support before his death. Again, it was ruled as a natural cause due to his age. At the time, the deaths of her husband weren't deemed suspicious, so all of their bodies were cremated. But after Isao's murder, the police took a look back at the pattern that had emerged and started investigating Chiseko further. During their investigation, law enforcement discovered that she had likely attempted to kill her fiancé, Toshiaki Suhiro, with cyanide back in 2007. He survived the attempted murder because he only drank a small amount of the poison, though he died 2 years later of cancer. Police found traces of cyanide in a stool sample that had been kept by the hospital. In 2012, a man that Chiseko was in a relationship with, Masanori Honda, who was 71, died while riding his mini bike. His death was thought to be caused by an arrhythmia or abnormal heart rate, but otherwise heart-related as well. In 2013, she became involved with retired architect Minoru Hiyuki, who was 75. He got sick after they had dinner together and died soon after. At the time, his cause of death was listed as lung cancer. Soon after Minoru's death, she married Isao Kakihi. He was a retired salaryman and had been covered by life insurance at the time of his death. The couple had been set up using a matchmaking service. Law enforcement learned that Chiseko used 10 different matchmaking agencies, and her profile had very specific requirements for her future partners: elderly, without children, wealthy, and owned his own home. Law enforcement determined that she had a pattern. When she found a new boyfriend or husband, she would change her last name to theirs and immediately open multiple bank accounts. It was reported that she had pocketed at least 1 billion yen, roughly 9.1 million in American, in insurance and inheritance payouts. However, she lost much of it due to failed investments and bad financial trading. Chiseko was arrested in November 2014, 11 months after Isao's murder. She was charged with the murder of Isao Kakihi, the murder of 2 of her boyfriends, and the attempted murder of Toshiaki Suhiro. She wasn't charged in connection with the deaths of her 3 previous husbands, as too much time had passed and there was little evidence. Upon her arrest, law enforcement were able to search her home. Police suspected Chiseko would kill the men with capsules or drinks laced with cyanide. After searching both of her homes in Osaka and Muko, they confiscated possible evidence including medical books, pills, capsules, and wafers used to wrap a powdered medicine. They also found traces of cyanide in a plant pot that she had attempted to dispose of.
私が毒を手に入れる手段がないですよ。こんなどんなしてその手に入れるんですかって言いたいですよね。
Her trial began in 2017, and she was 70 when it started, and the trial drew a lot of media attention. Chiseko was quickly dubbed the Black Widow or the Poison Lady by Japanese media. According to investigators, she was romantically involved to approximately 10 men over the years and had likely been involved in the deaths of 8 of them. During the time between Isaiah's death and her arrest, she had started seeing 2 new men. One, a man in his 80s, took to the stand as a witness in her trial. He had met Chiseko on a matchmaking website and was immediately taken by her charm, and after their 4th meeting, he gave her his house key. He said he'd been lonely after his wife had died and wanted to live with Chiseko, but he'd broken up with her after receiving a warning about her from the police. Chiseko initially stated that she would remain silent during her defense questioning, so her lawyers pleaded not guilty on her behalf. But then she stunned the courts by admitting to the murder of Isaiah, saying, "I killed my husband. I was waiting for the right timing as I wanted to kill him out of deep hatred." She also told the court, "I had no intention of hiding the guilt. I will laugh it off and die if I am sentenced to death tomorrow." She later attempted to retract her statement, saying she had no recollection of it. Her lawyers said that Chiseko was suffering from dementia and argued that her statements could not be considered credible. Chiseko was found guilty on 3 murder charges and on 1 count of attempted murder and was sentenced to hang by the Kyoto District Courts.
An elderly Japanese woman dubbed the Black Widow in a serial murder case has been sentenced to death.
Her lawyer appealed the sentence, calling it unjust as she had early-stage dementia and the prosecution failed to prove how she had obtained and stored the cyanide. The court acknowledged she had developed dementia sometime around 2015, but was determined that she was competent to stand trial, as the disease was progressing slowly and her symptoms weren't serious. The judge rejected her lawyer's claims that she couldn't be held responsible for her crimes due to her dementia, stating that her crimes were premeditated and she properly understood the situation. After her arrest, Japan's criminal justice system was scrutinized for not investigating several of her previous partners' deaths as suspicious. Autopsies weren't performed for many of the victims when they had died, but if they had, the police could have stopped Chiseko from killing more men. And in June of 2021, the Supreme Court of Japan upheld Chiseko's death sentence ruling. The judge stated she used a matchmaking agency to get acquainted with elderly victims, one after another, and poison them after making them trust her. It is a ruthless crime based on planned and strong murderous intention. The judge also stated that even taking into consideration her age, the death penalty was unavoidable. The date of her death sentence has not been released, as in Japan, inmates on death row do not know their sentence is being carried out until hours before it happens. Robert Durst, the would-be heir of multi-millionaire Seymour Durst, had been set to inherit an empire. However, multiple allegations of deceit, murder, and wild and violent outbursts caused him to be pushed far away from his family and far away from the legacy company that could have been his. Those closest to him often met violent, untimely, and unsolved ends. Until now. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, to Seymour Durst and Bernice Herstein. He and his 3 younger siblings, Douglas, Thomas, and Wendy, were raised in Scarsdale, New York, just north of the city where the family built their fortune. While Durst later became infamous in his own rights, he was born into a family whose name carried a lot of weight and wealth in New York City. Joseph Durst, Robert's grandfather, had built a billion-dollar real estate empire with the Durst Organization, starting with his first building purchase in 1912. Today, the company is one of the city's largest family-run real estate organizations, with his brother Douglas at the helm. Durst's younger years were fraught with trauma. When Durst was 7 years old, his mother fell off the roof of their home and died. Durst claimed that his father had brought him to the window and witnessed her death, though his brother Douglas disputes that claim. At the time, the newspapers had said Bernice had fallen off the roof after overdosing on asthma medication, but some family members, including Robert, claimed it was suicide. Durst struggled with his mental health after his mother's death. When he was 10 years old, he was assessed by a psychiatrist who claimed Durst couldn't be treated because he had personality decomposition and possibly even schizophrenia. Durst attended Scarsdale High School, where classmates described him as a loner. He then attended Pennsylvania's Lehigh University, where he graduated in 1965 with a bachelor's degree in economics. He then enrolled in a doctoral program at the University of California in Los Angeles, where he met Susan Berman, an aspiring writer who quickly became his close friend. Durst withdrew from the UCLA program and moved back to New York in 1969. In the fall of 1971, he met Kathy McCormick, an 18-year-old dental hygienist who lived in one of the buildings owned by the Durst organization. They had met when Durst went to pick up the rent. Kathy had just moved to New York City from Long Island. She was a bright, charming young woman who was incredibly warm and likable the moment she walked into a room. The two instantly hit it off. Kathy didn't mind his cool affection and described him as sweet and sensitive. In the early 1970s, Durst opened a health food store in Vermont called All Good Things. After just 2 dates together, Durst asked Kathleen to move into his home near the store, and in January of 1972, she took him up on the offer. The couple were smitten, though there were many times when the couple's 10-year age gap caused issues. The two also came from 2 totally different worlds. Durst from wealth and power, Kathy came from a modest Irish Catholic household. She had very much been swept up in the lifestyle that came along with being a Durst. A year later, after pressure from his father to move back to New York City and work for the Durst organization, Robert closed his health food store and moved back to the city with Kathleen. On Durst's 30th birthday, April 12, 1973, the two were married. Their marriage had started off a loving one, but when they moved from Vermont back to New York, there had been a remarkable change. Kathy said that Seymour Durst brought out the worst in Bobby, and he had turned into a completely different person from the man she fell in love with in Vermont. At first, Bobby loved showing Kathy off, taking her to the best and biggest events in New York and showing her his world. It was a world where Kathy shined brightly, and even Seymour approved of his new daughter-in-law. But as time went on, Robert's affections turned even colder, and for a long while Kathy kept just how miserable she was to herself. Occasionally, she would drop hints that Robert had an anger problem. At first, it was just yelling, then turned to pretending to hit her, but each year the hints would get worse and worse, until eventually they were no longer hints. Kathleen's brother Jim McCormick said he first witnessed Durst abusing Kathleen at a family Christmas party when he grabbed her by the hair. Kathleen had kept numerous diaries filled with details about how Kathleen had been suffering in the marriage. Robert was cheap and, despite having a vast bank account, watched over every penny that Kathleen spent. People never understood why the budding socialite married to a millionaire was working so hard in medical school to become a doctor. She would laugh and tell people it was her calling and that she wanted to have a career on her own, but becoming a doctor also would give her some freedoms, money that she earned herself and could be spent or saved as she needed. A few years into their marriage, Durst had dropped a bombshell. He didn't want children, which devastated Kathy. She poured her disappointment into school, but it had caused a fracture in their relationship that never quite repaired. Durst said that he might consider adopting, which had given Kathy a little hope, but every time she set up an appointment with an agency, Durst refused to go. In 1976, Kathy got pregnant. Durst was enraged and accused her of getting pregnant on purpose. He forced her to get an abortion, threatening divorce if she didn't. She went through with the procedure but fell into a downward spiral of grief and depression. It was also around this time when she learned for the first time that Durst was having an affair. She had learned of the affair when she discovered Polaroid pictures of their medicine cabinet and closets. When she asked what the photos were, Durst revealed he'd had a woman in their home and he'd moved things around to make the apartment appear to be only occupied by him. He had used the photos to put everything back where it belonged before Kathy returned. This had caused an unrepairable rift between the couple. After this, no love remained in their relationship, and Kathy seemed to be the only one suffering. In early 1982, 29-year-old Kathleen was in her final year of school at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, studying to become a pediatrician. That same year, she was treated for facial bruises at the Bronx Hospital. She had confided to a friend that Durst had beaten her when she confronted him about another affair. She knew he'd taken up with a woman named Prudence Farrow, the same Prudence that the Beatles sang about in Dear Prudence. The stresses of medical school alone were crippling enough, but the near-daily physical and emotional abuse was breaking Kathy. She began to drink excessively and use drugs to cope with the abuse. She barely slept or ate, and friends noticed their once bubbly, bright friend was a shell of her former self, detached and constantly frayed and nervous.
In the beginning, it was Prince Charming and Cinderella. Time went by, I would say that it became more and more violent. When I was in law school and she was in medical school, I had call forwarded to where I was, and she would call me late at night for hours about his violence.
She said to me, Gilberta, promise me if something happens, you'll check it out. I'm afraid of Bobby. And I just said, Kathy, of course.
You're angry that, that this can't be happening. You're basically in disbelief. Kathy had a heart of gold. She loved Bob. She absolutely loved him at the very beginning. And he was good to her. I believe he loved her.
Kathleen wanted a divorce and began telling friends that she was going to leave Durst once she finally finished medical school. Durst caught wind of that, and in response, he canceled her credit cards, removed her from their joint bank account, and refused to pay for her next semester's college tuition. She then demanded a divorce and $250,000 settlement. She had told friends she was threatening Durst. She claimed to have proof that Durst had been embezzling money from his father and had made fraudulent claims on his tax returns as well as her own. Soon before Kathleen disappeared, she was at her New York City apartment with two friends, Bill Stevenson and George Kearns. According to Bill, he had gone to the city multiple times to help Kathleen plan an escape from her violent marriage. One morning, Bill said Durst showed up at the door, threw a wad of cash at Kathleen's face, and said, "This isn't happening," referring to the divorce. Kathleen told Robert she was done and moving to Delaware. George, who also witnessed the incident, said that there was a lot of yelling and screaming. He said, whatever happened could have happened that morning if we hadn't been there. I mean, he had just no control over himself, just kind of out of his mind, angry. 10 days later, Kathleen was gone. Kathleen was last seen alive on January 31st, 1982. She had attended a dinner party without Robert at her friend Gilberte Najami's home in Connecticut. She had shown up unexpectedly and, according to Gilberte, wasn't acting like herself. While Kathleen typically wore high-quality clothes, she showed up in red sweatpants. She was also visibly upset when she arrived at Gilberte's. Durst called her multiple times during her visit, screaming through the phone for her to come home. Though she didn't want to, she eventually left the party to return to their house in the South Salem hamlet of Westchester County, New York. Gilberte said in an interview, "The last conversation that I had with Kathy was a very powerful conversation. As she was leaving my house, she turned to me and said, 'Gilberta, promise me if something happens to me, you'll check it out. I'm afraid of what Bobby might do.' It was the last time anyone besides Robert sees Kathleen."
Kathy told anybody who would listen, all her friends, if anything ever happens to me, look to Bob. Bob did it. Don't let him get away with it. The moment Kathy disappeared, I knew that Bob had done away with her. I mean, I was hoping against hope that really maybe he had just beaten her up and we'd find her some way, but I knew she was dead.
According to him, he and Kathleen argued that night. Kathleen wanted to go to their apartment in the city instead of staying at the house, so he dropped her off at the Katanoa train station to get the 9:15 p.m. train to Manhattan. Afterwards, as he told the New York City Police Department, he went for a walk, had a drink at his neighbor's house, spoke with Kathleen on a payphone, and then went to bed. The neighbors he allegedly had seen, Bill and Ruth Mayer, later testified that Durst lied to the police and that he never visited them on the night of Kathleen's disappearance. Ruth also testified that Kathleen had told her in private that Durst was abusing her. Though Ruth encouraged her to report it, Kathleen was afraid to. Before her disappearance, Kathleen had made plans to meet Gilberte at a pub in Manhattan, but Kathleen never showed. Gilberte was worried and called the police several times over the next few days after not seeing or hearing from Kathleen. On February 4th, Kathleen's college called Durst and said she'd called in sick on February 1st and had missed a full week of classes. And so, on February 5th, Durst reported his wife missing. Detectives wondered why Durst had waited so long to report his wife missing. He very calmly explained that he and Kathy often spent days apart when she was working and studying so much at the hospital. He was described as completely calm and unmoved. He seemed completely unfazed that his wife had been missing for several days. What had made things even more peculiar, he took to the press soon after, offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to her safe return, though he later reduced it, saying the original article had made a mistake. Kathleen's family found out in the newspapers, having no idea that Kathleen had gone missing. Due to his high-profile status, the disappearance, and Durst himself gained a lot of media attention, so his longtime friend Susan Berman stepped in as his unofficial spokeswoman, making statements and answering questions on his behalf. During the initial police investigation, the doorman at Kathleen and Durst's Manhattan apartment building claimed to have seen Kathleen at the building on February 1st, but he only saw her from behind and far away, so he wasn't certain if it was her. He later told investigators that he hadn't seen her at all, and that he actually might not have even been working during that time. 3 weeks after Durst reported Kathleen missing, the building superintendent found her belongings in the building's trash compactor. Kathleen's friends took her disappearance into their own hands and broke into Kathleen and Durst's South Salem home in hopes that they'd find her. They'd either find her or find clues to her whereabouts. When they arrived, the house had been turned upside down. Kathleen's mail had been ripped open and her belongings were stuffed into the garbage. In their Manhattan apartment, Durst had thrown so many belongings into the garbage chute that led to the building's incinerator that the building manager asked him to stop because he was clogging up the chute. He threw out her clothes, medical school books, jewelry, everything that belonged to Kathy. When Kathy's friends had been searching the South Salem home, they also found an itinerary that they thought had been written by Durst.
I went through his garbage, and I found that he was throwing her things out right away. Within 5 weeks at least of her disappearance. He knew she wasn't coming back.
It outlined every single thing he did that night that Kathleen went missing, as well as the days following. They passed it on to the lead detective working the case, who agreed it was an odd thing to do. Innocent people don't need to write down an exact minute-by-minute recounting of their day, though someone who needed to keep their lies straight might. While New York City police explored leads and questioned Durst, it didn't go unnoticed that higher-ups were not pushing them to solve the case. The investigation had only been a few weeks in when it was already beginning to wind down. Normally, high-profile cases like this would bring in all sorts of people to breathe down the necks of detectives. Not this case. It seemed that the Durst family didn't care about New York's finest working the case at all. They certainly weren't cooperating with law enforcement. Durst refused interviews, polygraph tests, and even answering the most basic questions, though he did take several interviews with reporters.
did you have anything to do with the death of your wife?
I don't know that she's dead.
Do you think that it's possible that she's alive now?
It's possible. Not likely.
At first playing the role of concerned and sympathetic husband, though his tone quickly turned to annoyed and began to slander Kathleen. He told the press that he believed Kathleen had left him and would run off with another man. There was so little evidence in Kathleen's disappearance. Law enforcement had even worked with several psychics to try and develop new leads. Though they had suspicions Durst was involved, he had lawyered up with one of the best criminal attorneys in New York, and without evidence, the case went cold, and slowly Robert Durst's missing first wife was reduced to a file in a cold case locker. After Kathy's disappearance, Robert Durst takes a big step back from the New York City social scene he once dominated. He only kept a close circle of friends, primarily just consisting of Susan Berman and a select few others. Between 1990 and 2000, Durst attempted to reinvent himself, starting with his marriage. In 1990, he sold the South Salem home that he and Kathleen shared, and unbeknownst to Kathleen's family, filed for divorce from his still missing wife, claiming spousal abandonment. Durst allegedly started behaving oddly at work, which included urinating in trash cans. While he was next in line to take over his family's company, his father Seymour appointed his younger brother Douglas to the position in 1994 instead. Durst accused his brother of stealing the company from him, causing a rift between Robert and the rest of the family. In 1999, the New York City Police reopened Kathleen's missing person case. They searched Durst's former South Salem home for the time, as well as the nearby Truesdale Lake. Then, in 2000, the investigation into Kathleen's disappearance became public. In November of 2000, Durst left New York after his sister Wendy told him that police were reopening Kathleen's case. He escaped the city to avoid police inquiries and started renting a $300 a month apartment in Galveston, Texas, where no one knew who he was. While living in Galveston, he pretended to be a mute woman named Dorothy Siner, a name he took from a high school friend. While in Galveston, he was spotted wearing women's wigs around town and visiting the library to look up articles about himself. Durst later said he posed as a mute woman because of his distinctive voice. He believed anyone would have been able to identify him if he spoke. The next month, Durst married Deborah Cheriton, a Manhattan real estate broker he had been dating off and on for the past decade. It was a hasty ceremony officiated by a single rabbi picked out of the phone book. They are still married to this day, though they've reportedly never lived together over the course of their marriage and have gone years without speaking. Little is known about his time in Texas. Little is known about why he married Deborah so hastily. Though in New York, spouses are legally exempt from testifying about their spouse, and are also exempt from disclosing confidential communication. Then, according to Durst, Susan Berman called him in December of 2000. The police wanted to interview her about Kathleen's disappearance. In December of 2000, Susan Berman was living alone at her home in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, where she was working as a journalist and author. A so-called mafia princess, Susan wrote about her family ties to reported gangsters, more specifically her father, David "Davy" Berman, a Las Vegas mob boss. Susan and Durst became fast friends after meeting as students at UCLA. When she was 12, her father had died on the operating table, and her mother had died of a drug overdose a year later. These traumas bonded Susan to Durst, as he believed his mother had also committed suicide by jumping off the roof of their home as a child. Susan would call Durst the little brother she never had and was very protective of him. When Susan got married in 1984, it was Durst who walked her down the aisle. The two had been nearly inseparable for decades. When Kathleen had disappeared, Susan had been Durst's unofficial spokesperson. He would give her statements through Susan, and she had also been his alibi for the night Kathleen had gone missing. However, she and Durst drifted apart when he disappeared out of the blue for years. She eventually left New York, settling in California instead, where she wrote 2 books about her life as a mob boss's daughter. Though her life was actually quite sad, she spun it to sound like an incredibly glamorous life growing up as mob royalty. Susan was also an incredibly paranoid person. She always thought people were after her because of her work. Though many of the people she wrote about were long gone, and a lot of the old mafia days she had experienced as a child were long gone by the 2000s. No one else really gave credit to her paranoia. They always described her as being incredibly hyperbolic, dramatic, and over the top. Leading up to her death, Susan was short on money. She was facing eviction from her home and was absolutely flat broke, and in desperation, she reached out to Durst. Though she wasn't able to get a hold of him conventionally, she instead left a voicemail message on a phone number he maintained in New York. Without a word, he gifted her $50,000 that she used to pay her debts and get herself back on track. She had recently been hired to work on a couple new big projects. Things were starting to look up for Susan. She had been grateful to have the little brother she never had back in her life. However, she was contacted by the Westchester District Attorney Janine Pirro, who informed Susan she was reopening the Kathy Durst case 18 years later and wanted to interview her. Susan had never been interviewed in the initial investigation. The interview had been arranged to take place sometime early in the new year, and somehow the fact that the new DA wanted to interview Susan Berman had made front-page news in New York. On December 19th, Susan spoke with her friend actress Kim Langford, telling her that she had the story of a lifetime and had information that was going to blow the top off things. Kim assumed the information was related to a project she was working on about her life growing up around the mob in Vegas. She also told Kim she had recently spoken to a psychic, who had told her she'd die a violent death that involved a gun. On Christmas Eve in 2000, police were called to Susan's home after neighbors reported that her dogs were running loose on the street and barking wildly. Police arrived at Susan's home and found the back door ajar. In the doorway of one of the bedrooms, they found Susan Berman, 55 years old. She had been shot execution style, with 1 bullet to the back of the head. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Police determined she'd been murdered a day or 2 before the discovery of the body. Some speculated that it was a mob hit, made in retaliation for the information she was about to reveal in this upcoming project. Others suspected her manager, Niall Brenner, who she reportedly had a very turbulent relationship. Friends said that because of Susan's career, she was extremely paranoid. They said she always had her home locked up tight and never opened the door to strangers, so they felt it was unlikely that she had been murdered by someone she didn't know. That left only a handful of people who Susan trusted implicitly. But when Westchester County District Attorney Janine Pirro revealed that Susan had been on the short list of witnesses she wanted to speak to about Kathleen's disappearance, many of Kathleen's friends speculated Durst had killed Susan to keep her quiet, though those from Susan's social circle said she wouldn't have testified against him due to her mob-like loyalty. Soon after Susan's body was discovered, Los Angeles police received an anonymous letter postmarked for December 23rd. The letter was addressed to the Beverly Hills Police, with Beverly misspelled. Inside the note had Susan's address with 1 word, cadaver. As it turns out, Susan did have key information to share. According to her friend Linda Obst, Susan told her that she was the one that called the New York Albert Einstein College of Medicine on February 1st when she had allegedly called in sick. According to the prosecuting attorney, Durst asked Susan to cover for him when Kathleen had first disappeared, by posing as Kathleen and calling in sick to school so people would believe she'd made it to Manhattan. They theorized that Durst had killed Susan after discovering her scheduled interview with the police, fearing she'd turn him in. Miriam Barnes, Susan's close friend, testified that Susan called her and told her that she'd done a favor for Durst, but was nervous telling her about it. She told Miriam, "If anything happens to me, Bobby did it." A closer look into Durst's activity revealed he'd been in California in late December and had left on a late-night flight from San Francisco to New York on the day she was murdered. At the time of the investigation, Durst was questioned about Susan's murder, but never charged. Robert Durst did not attend the funeral of his oldest and dearest friend, Susan Berman. On September 30th, 2001, a man fishing with his son in Galveston Bay discovered a human torso floating in the water. They called the police and searched the area and found several garbage bags, each bag containing dismembered body parts. A total of 12 bags were found. In the bags, they also found an outer packaging for a bow saw, a receipt for garbage bags and drop cloths, and a newspaper that contained a handwritten note, an address, 2213 Avenue K. At the address, officers searched the garbage cans nearby, where they found more black garbage bags similar to the ones they had already recovered. Inside the dumpsters, they found an empty trash bag box, packaging for a drop cloth, packaging for a 4-inch paring knife, a .22 caliber shell casing, and an eviction notice addressed to Morris Black. Morris Black was one of the tenants in the shared home on Avenue K. He had been a veteran with a murky past. He was estranged from his family and his ex-wife. He lived a nomadic life, and if he occasionally reached out to someone, he never disclosed where he was. He had landed in Texas sometime in the mid-90s, and he'd been arrested in '98 for threatening to blow up a utility company over an issue with his bill. His lifestyle made it hard for a timeline of his life to be tracked down. There were decades of time without any documentation tying him to any particular place. Those in Galveston who had met Morris described him as a grumpy old man who was suspicious of everyone and prone to screaming outbursts. He used to live in New York, but seemed to have gone off the grid in 1982. It was also discovered that Black had $130,000 in an out-of-state bank account. Despite not having worked for decades, he had been living off of the money for many years. Friends and family of Black had no idea he had that kind of money, and he was now missing. They were able to execute a search warrant for Morris's home. Once inside, they discovered blood evidence everywhere, in the bathroom sink, the kitchen, in all of the drains. They sprayed luminol throughout the apartment, and it lit up like Christmas. Walls, floors, and drag marks that led from Morris's apartment to the apartment across the hall. The apartment across the hall belonged to Dorothy Siner, a mute old woman whose neighbors had little to offer about who this woman was. She was rarely seen, had been known to travel frequently, kept her shades drawn, and kept to herself. Investigators got a court order to enter, and again found blood everywhere. In Dorothy's kitchen, there had been several cuts in the linoleum, and when officers pulled it back, they had discovered pools of dried blood underneath. Unlike in Morris's apartment, this apartment hadn't been cleaned as thoroughly. There was dry blood splatter all over the place, along with a paring knife, a cleaver, a handsaw, and a pistol, which was suspected to be the murder weapon. One of the bags recovered from the bay was empty. It had a large rip in it, and officers concluded that it was the one that contained Morris's head, which was the only body part not recovered. It also likely contained key evidence that would answer the question that still remained: cause of death. They had been able to compare fingerprints from Morris's time in the military to those on the body to identify him. A medical examiner determined that the body parts recovered from the bay were that of 71-year-old Morris Black.
Did it look like somebody who was doing this in a panic?
This looked like someone had done this before. And the medical examiner testified that the person who cut this body up knew what kind of instrument to use on what bone and what muscle and what part of the body.
Do you think it's possible that Robert Durst is guilty of more than 3 murders?
Well, I do believe that he's guilty of more than 3 murders, just because I saw what he did to the body of Morris Black.
Dorothy Siner was also missing, and police turned their attention to finding her. They had been able to determine that Morris had likely been murdered in his apartment, but had been dismembered in her apartment. Why had a man been dismembered in an old mute lady's apartment? It didn't make sense. They were able to unravel Dorothy's true identity when they found a receipt in the building's trash. It was from a local optometrist, and it had Durst's name on it. With that information, they concluded that perhaps there wasn't a Miss Signer. Perhaps Robert Durst had been masquerading as an old mute woman. Neighbors couldn't recall seeing Dorothy around the time that Morris disappeared, though they did recall seeing a man loading garbage bags into a Honda CR-V. They hadn't recognized him, but noted he made several trips in and out of Dorothy's apartment. Police took down a description of the vehicle and put out a bolo. They also looked in the national databases to try and get any information they could about Miss Signer. They found her, and she was alive, but claimed to not reside in Galveston, Texas, and she certainly wasn't mute. When asked if she knew Robert Durst, she replied that she did. They had attended high school together back in the 50s. She was baffled. She hadn't spoken to Durst in decades and had no idea why there was an apartment rented using her name and social security number. 7 days later, a vehicle matching the description is found, and they pull over the driver and search the car. Inside, they saw a bow saw and visible blood in the trunk of the vehicle. They arrested the 58-year-old driver on October 9, 2001, a man named Robert Durst, and charged him with the murder of Morris Black. After paying a $300,000 bail, Durst left Texas and went on the run. After failing to appear at his court date, he was declared a fugitive. While on the run, Durst had the nerve to rent a car in Mobile, Alabama, under the name Morris Black. And then, in another strange twist, he was found and arrested at a Wegmans grocery store in Bath, Pennsylvania. He was accused of shoplifting a $6 chicken sandwich, bandages, and a newspaper. And even though he had $38,000 in cash with him at the time, along with 2 loaded handguns, also in his car was a Medicaid card and a driver's license belonging to Morris Black. Durst had also shaved all of his hair as well as his eyebrows, and at first he hadn't been recognized as the millionaire fugitive. It was only when the arresting officer ran his social security number that he discovered the warrant for his arrest. In January of 2002, he returned to Texas to stand trial for the murder of Morris Black. According to Durst's testimony, he came home on September 28, 2001, to find Morris in his apartment angry. While Morris had a key to the apartment, Durst hadn't been expecting him. Durst said that he immediately suspected Morris of taking the gun that he'd stored in the oven. When Durst asked him where it was, Morris reportedly stood and pointed it at Durst. Durst claimed that he grabbed the gun and the 2 men fell to the ground. That's when the gun went off, though he says he never touched the trigger and killed Morris with a gunshot to the head. Durst claims he tried to get the help of a neighbor, but no one answered. So he went back to his apartment and started cleaning up the blood himself. He said he then drank a bottle of Jack Daniels and dismembered Morris's body before dumping it in the Galveston Bay. Durst said he didn't go to the police because he didn't think they'd believe him, given his past, reputation, and suspicious situation. Though according to a private investigator, Bobby Baca, she had been able to piece a connection going way back of Durst and Morris Black. Morris had a brother, Harry Black, and the 2 of them owned a construction business in New York back in the 80s. According to family members, it had been funded by the Durst organization, specifically Robert Durst. Harry had passed in 2003, but his wife had said that when he learned that Morris had been murdered, he was concerned that he would be next. When asked why, he said that he knew dark secrets. Black's wife told Baca that she believed that the brothers knew something about Kathleen Durst's disappearance. Prosecutors believe that Durst murdered Morris when he found out his true identity, and he killed him out of fear that he'd been found and charged with Kathleen's murder. Robert had specifically chosen Galveston, and he arrived concealing his identity as an old woman, only to show up at a low-income housing building next door to a man that he used to fund to do work for him. And if we believe that Durst murdered Susan to tie up a loose end regarding Kathleen's disappearance, perhaps Black had also been connected in some way. In his trial, Durst had hired the best criminal defense attorneys that money could buy. The trial lasted over 2 months, and despite a mountain of evidence, On November 11, 2003, Durst was found not guilty of Morris's death and was acquitted.
Glenda Brentz was an alternate juror in the Robert Durst murder trial. She's convinced the New York real estate heir's testimony, full of holes and inconsistencies, should have landed him with a guilty verdict. Instead, he'll walk away.
In my opinion, it was his story against the evidence, and I didn't believe his story.
But the 8-man, 4-woman jury disagreed.
It wasn't proven, so you have reasonable doubt.
The jurors say there wasn't enough evidence to rule out Durst's claim that the gun went off accidentally as he struggled with neighbor Morris Black in September of 2001. Prosecutors are in disbelief.
Mr. Durst is not going to be invited to my house for any reason at all.
Though acknowledging Durst's history as an unusual character, a loner prone to drug and alcohol binges, the jury stands by its decision to acquit.
I wouldn't be asking him to escort my daughter to her senior prom this year, but, I can't say what Durst will live. Durst is not the only crazy person in Galveston.
It was a shocking end to a brutal trial. He was initially put on a $3 billion bail due to his previous bail jumping and tampering with evidence, but the amount was eventually lowered to $450,000 after a court found the amount unconstitutional. In October of 2004, just as he was about to be paroled, Pennsylvania authorities charged Durst with weapon possession stemming from his time on the lam. In July of 2005, he was released from federal prison and sent to Texas to serve parole. But Durst couldn't seem to stay in one place. In December of 2005, he was arrested for a parole violation for making unauthorized trips to Galveston. He got caught after visiting a Texas mall, where he happened to run into the judge who was presiding over his murder trial. In February of 2006, Durst was released from prison, and his parole supervision ended 9 months later. Once again, he was a free man.
You testified at Durst's parole hearing, and it wasn't long after that that you found a dismembered cat on your doorstep. Why do you think Durst was involved with that?
When I came home and I drove up, I saw something right at the foot of my sidewalk, and at first I thought it was a dead rat. And as I got out of my car and focused on it, I realized it was a severed cat head with the front 2 legs attached. And I thought, oh my God, what in the world is that? Is that really what I think it is? And as I'm trying to process this, it dawns on me that this is a severed head. And this was done perfectly. It was clean. This was a hot June 29th day in Texas, which is very, very hot. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a drop of blood, there wasn't a body fluid, there wasn't a hair out of place, and it was laid there perfectly with the front 2 paws crossed. Mm-hmm. It was placed there very, 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 very carefully. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, oh my God, what is this? And it hit me, oh my God, this is a severed head. And I knew that he'd had a history of destroying animals and cutting up animals and doing horrible things to them. Mm. And I thought back to that moment when he was in my chambers and he was looking at all of my pictures when he was angry about me not allowing a cartoon in for their defense. And I ran into my house thinking, oh God, please let my dogs be okay. And they were fine. But it was the fact that it hit me that it was a severed head.
And when you, the part of the reason you linked this to him was, of course, you had testified at that parole hearing, you had been the judge in the case. But you mentioned other things he'd done to animals. His family has raised questions about this, and I'll note it's his family. We don't know if, none of this has been fully substantiated, but according to his brother, he had dogs. They were all Alaskan Malamutes, all named Igor. All of them mysteriously disappeared, one after the other, all of these dogs. So do you believe this story? What do you think happened to those dogs?
Well, actually, I didn't hear them from the Durst family. I'd heard it from several people, including Jim McCormick, Kathy's brother. And during the trial, there was a photograph introduced that was found on Bob when he was arrested in Pennsylvania that had him and Kathy in it and had the dog in it. And the dog's name was Igor. Well, then later when he was talking in the tapes that I listened to, he was talking about another dog that he'd had more recently named Igor. Well, I thought that dog can't be 20 years old. And so later I was told by Jim that he had a succession of dogs, and every one of them was named Igor, and every one of them died an unnatural, mysterious death.
And there was a moment on those tapes where you think he used the word Igor to refer to a human being or what he wanted to do to a human being?
Yes, I do. There was a time when he was talking to his wife, Deborah, about going to his brother's house when he was on the run. And he stood in the driveway, and there was some sort of a social event going on, and he told his wife that he thought about doing an Igor to his brother. And his wife stopped and said, "Stop, stop, stop. This is a recorded line, Bob." And it was clear what he meant, and it was clear that she understood what he meant enough to stop him from talking anymore on a recorded line.
"4 years later, Durst's infamous deeds were brought to the big screen for the first time. In December of 2010, All Good Things, a movie loosely based on Durst's life, starring Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst, debuted. The movie is about a man who kills his wife, best friend, neighbor, and dog. After its release, Durst contacted the director and praised the movie, but said that he didn't like that the dog was murdered. Him and the director Andrew Jarecki kept in contact over the years, and despite Durst's lawyer's advice against it, Durst eventually agreed to appear in an interview for the HBO documentary series Jarecki was making about Durst's life. It was called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. Jarecki first interviewed Durst in 2010, during which Durst denied any responsibility for Susan and Kathleen's deaths and disappearances.
Did not tell the whole truth. Nobody tells the whole truth.
Did you have anything to do with the death of your wife?
I don't know that she's dead.
Do you think that it's possible that she's alive now?
It's possible. Not likely. I felt terrible for Susan. I was astonished that they were putting all this together, that I did it or I caused it to be done. An interview is a big risk for you. Why do you want to do an interview?
With the help of Susan's stepson, it was a letter written by Durst, and it includes the same misspelling of Beverly. In his second interview with Durst, Jarecki brought out both letters and confronted Durst with the similarities. During a break, Durst goes to the bathroom and is recorded saying this.
Or maybe this is the bathroom.
Yeah, that's...
You're right, this is the bathroom. There it is. You're caught. You're right, of course. But you can't imagine. What's in the house? Oh, I want this. Disaster. Right. Irish. Listen. I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Kill them all. Of course.
In the interview, Durst also admits to lying about what he told police about the night Kathleen went missing. That he told police he dropped her off at the train station and visited his neighbors because it was what they wanted to hear. In 2013, the director began sharing his footage and discoveries with the police. In 2014, the filmmakers discovered the recording of Durst seemingly admitting to the murders, and the LAPD concluded that Durst authored the cadaver letter sent to the police, arming them with the evidence needed to arrest Durst. The day before the final documentary episode aired, March 14, 2015, Durst was arrested on a warrant charging him with the first-degree murder of Susan Berman.
He's the infamous heir to one of the country's wealthiest real estate families, long suspected in connection with a pair of murders and a disappearance dating back decades. Tonight, Robert Durst is behind bars, arrested overnight in the lobby of a New Orleans hotel, accused of killing a female friend in Los Angeles 15 years ago. The investigation got a boost in recent weeks thanks to new evidence revealed in a documentary series that Durst willingly participated in. Law enforcement sources say they feared Durst, who was using a fake name, was a flight risk. We begin tonight with NBC's Stephanie Gosk.
Robert Durst, heir to a multi-billion-dollar real estate fortune, sits in a New Orleans jailhouse tonight awaiting extradition to California, accused of a murder committed over a decade ago. This from his own brother today. We are relieved and also grateful to everyone who assisted in the arrest of Robert Durst. We hope he will finally be held accountable for all he has done. Christmas Eve 2000, Susan Berman was killed execution-style in her L.A. home. At the time, investigators may have suspected the now 71-year-old, but there was no arrest. Berman was Durst's best friend and confidant. He denies murdering her in HBO's series The Jinx.
Police found him at the JW Marriott Hotel in New Orleans, along with a .38 caliber revolver, marijuana, $40,000 in cash, a map of Cuba, a shoulder-to-head latex mask, fake IDs, and his legitimate passport. Police suspected he was preparing to flee the country to Cuba. Durst was arraigned the next morning and held on bail pending an extradition hearing. The next day, he waived extradition so he could face the murder charge in LA, but it was delayed after Louisiana State Police charged him with felony weapon possession. The New Orleans judge denied Durst bail on the charges and determined Durst to be a flight risk. In February 2016, he accepted the plea deal on the charges and was sentenced to just over 7 years in prison. In November of 2016, Durst was transferred to Los Angeles County Jail to await trial for the murder of Susan Berman. During questioning, he tells a prosecutor that he was high on meth when asked why he would agree to be interviewed for the Jinx.
When I did the interviews for the Jinx, I was on meth. The whole time I was on meth.
The next year, Kathleen McCormick Durst was declared legally dead at the request of her family. Her family alleged from the beginning that Durst was involved with her disappearance and murder. The trial for Susan Berman's murder began on March 4, 2020, but it was halted for 14 months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In May of 2021, the case was resumed.
Mr. Durst, how do you feel about being in court today?
I'm not particularly happy about it. Other places I'd much rather be.
And when you say you're not particularly happy about it, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I'm here at my brother's trial, and it's not a pleasant experience to be at this trial of somebody I've known for 76 years now, and it's very difficult from many points of view.
Do you recognize this person here?
My brother Bob, yes.
Indicating the defendant, Your Honor?
Yeah.
Growing up, how did your brother treat you?
He treated me miserably. He would fight with me every chance. He would embarrass me at every opportunity. And it was a very difficult relationship.
And do you recall when he called you, what was his demeanor?
It was his tone was very neutral, and there was no great anxiety in his tone.
Did that seem unusual to you at the time?
It seemed a little strange, yes.
In things you've listened to, dealings you've had, statements you've been made aware of, has your brother indicated how he feels about you to this day?
Yes.
And what are those feelings?
He'd like to murder me.
And are you aware of your brother, in fact, making calls from Pennsylvania discussing that very subject?
I am aware of that, yes.
Did you take those, and this is a yes or no question, do you take those threats seriously?
Yes, I did.
And even in terms of your coming to court today, did you come with security that you had hired?
Yes, I hired security today.
And why did you hire security? What was the reason for that?
Because I have fear that my brother has threatened to kill me, and I have fear that he may have the means to do so.
And in terms of the security that you've hired and the concerns that you have, do they expressly relate back to the fear of your brother?
Yes.
Did you kill Susan Berman?
No.
Do you know who did?
No, I do not.
Do you realize you have an absolute right not to testify?
I am aware of that.
Do you want to testify in your own behalf?
Yes.
I want to first ask you about some of your health problems. Are you hard of hearing?
I am hard of hearing.
You've heard Tommy, your little brother, testify here that he resented you to this day for pulling a trick on him in a revolving door. Do you remember that event?
I remember Tommy's testimony. I don't remember the incident. Tommy said, and this is when he was an adult, so I don't know how old we were then. I don't remember when he was talking about me ignoring him in the revolving door. It was not when he was little. He was a grown-up.
What did you do after you and Kathy came back from your honeymoon?
I went to work at the Durst organization. It was just like I expected it to be, and I did not love it. I barely liked it at all. I was in a room with a whole bunch of suits.
During Susan Berman's trial, it was announced that Kathleen's case had been reclassified as murder and would be reinvestigated as a homicide case.
Her family wants to know what took so long to press charges. They're urging Westchester County's DA to investigate whether it was a cover-up.
We're going to go after everybody who got paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to participate in this cover-up.
Why did a series of district attorneys in Manhattan and Westchester County appear to decide to protect Robert Durst all these years? 2, why did the NYPD fail to conduct a competent and thorough investigation into Kathy's disappearance? Telling me, quote, we dropped the ball, unquote, just doesn't cut it. 3, although we appreciate the actions now being taken by DA Rocha, why did prior leaders of the Westchester District Attorney's Office agree to stand down so that Durst could be prosecuted in California for killing someone who helped him cover up Kathy's murder? 4, why did former DA Janine Pirro commence an investigation only to abandon it at the last minute?
On September 17th, after 3 days of jury deliberation, Robert Durst was found guilty of first-degree murder of Susan Berman, as well as lying in wait and killing a witness. Less than a month later, Los Angeles County Judge Mark Windham sentenced Durst to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That same month, the Westchester County, New York District Attorney's Office announced the Westchester County Grand Jury would be impaneled to hear witness testimonies and evidence in Kathleen's disappearance. In late October, Durst tested positive for COVID-19 and was hospitalized. The state investigator, believing Durst may not live long enough to be indicted, filed a criminal complaint charging him in Kathleen's death. On November 1st, 2021, Durst was indicted by the Westchester County Grand Jury on second-degree murder charges of Kathleen McCormick Durst and is currently awaiting trial. Time will tell if he lives long enough to face it. Though the decades-long horror show put on by Durst may soon come to an end, it's not soon enough for Kathleen's family. In a statement, they questioned why it took over 40 years to get an indictment accusing prosecutors of protecting the Durst family and the NYPD of failing to conduct competent and a thorough investigation into Kathleen's disappearance. They said in a statement, "We want both closure and justice for Kathy and our family who has suffered from her disappearance, murder, and concealment of her remains." There may also be other potential victims that could be connected to Durst, and we're going to discuss those now. On December 10th, 1971, in Middlebury, Vermont, Lynn Schultz went into a health food store called All Good Things. There she purchased some dried prunes. She'd been seen eating them while standing at a bus stop on Court Street around 12:30 p.m. She was 18 years old and had been a student at the Middlebury College. She returned to campus and was seen at her dorm. She left around 1 p.m. to attend a final exam but never showed up. She had last been seen at 2:15 p.m. at the same bus stop she had been at earlier, near All Good Things, and from there she vanished. Campus security did not initiate a search until 2 days after her disappearance, and the college didn't alert her parents for a week. Friends and family had noted she was homesick, but also knew she had studied relentlessly for this exam that she never got to take, and no one was able to explain why she'd never shown up, and instead had last been seen near a health food store. Her disappearance remains a cold case and is marked as a possible foul play. In 2015, authorities announced that they would be looking at Robert Durst as a possible suspect. Another young woman went missing, this time in 1997. Karen Mitchell was 16 and living in Eureka, California. Karen had visited her aunt's store on November 25, 1997, and she was headed to her part-time job at the Coastal Family Development Center. She was last seen walking down the road, and some witnesses claim they saw her get into a vehicle with an older man driving. The car was described as a blue Ford Granada or a Mercury Monarch or a Nissan. The driver was described as a Caucasian male, approximately 50 to 70 years old, with a balding, light gray or sandy blonde hair. The unidentified man had green or gray eyes and a large-sized nose that appeared to have been previously broken. He had a small build and wore eyeglasses. The driver was wearing a long-sleeve button-down light blue shirt. A missing person report was filed later that day by her aunt, who would learn she'd never made it to work when she went to pick up Karen. Extensive searches were undertaken, which had even included sniffer dogs. It was as if she had dropped off the face of the planet. The driver was never located for questioning. Durst's connection was credit card charges, putting him in the area of her disappearance. He also owned a home only 25 minutes from Eureka in Trinidad, California. He sold the home in 2000 after the murder of Susan Berman. It wasn't until the body of Morris Black washed up that Durst was finally brought to justice. Though had his body not been found so quickly, it likely would have been lost forever, taking with it all the evidence that had connected Durst to the murder. The medical examiner that had done the autopsy for Morris Black had noticed that the cuts had been precise and practiced. Based on how Black's body had been dismembered, the medical examiner had thought that the person responsible had either medical training or had been a hunter. Durst was neither, and it called into question how he got so skilled at disposing of murder victims. Durst had also used several aliases while he traveled. He also used several different social security numbers to rent cars, hotel rooms, credit cards, and rent apartments. Many of these aliases were people he knew from school, real people that had very faint connections to Durst. His aliases included Robert Allen Durst, a man of no relation but an exact same name, Robert Dean Jasowski, an old schoolmate, Ralph Durst, Everett Ward, James Cordes, Jim Terse, James S. Fleischman, Johnny Smith, Emilio Vignoli, Dorothy Siner, Diane Wynn, James Closty, and Morris Black. And those are only the ones that we can connect to Robert Durst. While he was traveling across the country, he often rented older cars, never anything flashy. He would dress down in inexpensive clothing, sometimes in full drag, and would often try and be as nondescript as possible. He would rent dirt cheap apartments across the country, paying in cash several months in advance, and disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. He would often hang around transient people, who often would disappear without a trace, only to open a credit card or rent a car years later. We may never have all the answers. Durst has faced several health issues in recent years. Though only 78, he appears to have aged dramatically, and he maintains his innocence despite exhaustive evidence against him. And to this day, it is unclear why he'd been so willing to murder Susan and Morris Black to cover up what he had done to Kathleen. Why had he been so willing to commit multiple other murders to cover up Kathleen's disappearance? There is always hope that one day he may decide to open up about what had actually happened to the people closest to him that had met untimely demises. It was a Sunday afternoon on August 27, 2005, when 911 dispatchers in Syracuse, New York, received a call from a distressed wife. She had said that she and her husband had had an argument and he'd been drinking heavily and had locked himself in their bedroom the night before. She said that she'd gone to a friend's house for the night and went to work that morning, but became concerned when he didn't come into work that day. Her name was Stacy Castor, and she was the office manager for her husband, David Castor's air conditioning company.
My husband has locked himself in our bedroom for the last day. Friday night we got into an argument, and he was aggressive, but he wasn't violent.
Okay, don't cry. We're going to check on him, make sure he's okay. Maybe he's depressed. Are you guys going through something right now?
Well, his father died a month ago, and he's been kind of weird acting the last month.
She said that her husband was no longer communicating with her from the bedroom and asked an officer to do a wellness check. An officer came by, and when he also couldn't get a response from David, he broke down the door. There they found David lying face down on the bed, deceased. At first glance, it looked to be that David had killed himself. The officer said that Stacy was shocked and hysterical, but this wasn't the first time Stacy had lost a husband. In 2000, her first husband, Michael Wallace, had died of a heart attack. At the time of Michael's death, there was little that stood out to doctors of anything suspicious, but officers thought there might be more to Stacy Castor than a run of bad luck. They decided to take a deeper look into the young, twice widow. Stacy met her first husband, Michael, while at a bar in Clay, New York. They met in 1985 when Stacy was only 17. Michael, 6 years older, was described as kind of a wild guy. He loved the fast life of partying, drinking, and having a good time. The two married in 1988 and had their first daughter, Ashley, the same year. Michael had a short stint in prison for DUI charges and had cooled his partying ways when he got out. The couple had their second daughter, Bree, in 1991, and the couple settled into a very everyday life. Michael worked at a large commercial air conditioner manufacturer, and Stacy worked in the billing department for an ambulance dispatch company. Money was tight for the family, but they were always able to make ends meet. Michael loved his daughters, but he had a clear favorite with his youngest, Bree. This bothered Stacy. Stacy wasn't a loving mother. She wasn't described as maternal, and she didn't seem to even like children, including her own. When Michael favored Bree over Ashley blatantly, Stacy decided she would have Ashley as her favorite, more to compete with Michael rather than putting Ashley first for her benefit. As the couple neared their 10th anniversary, their marriage was simply going through the motions. Stacy had concerns that Michael was having an affair, and she had told a friend that she wanted to get a divorce. In the winter of 1999, Michael had begun getting mysterious waves of illness. While he had a family function, he was described as acting unsteady, coughing, and looked swollen. Family members convinced Michael to seek medical attention, and he reluctantly went to a doctor. The doctor thought Michael was suffering from some sort of inner ear disorder because he wasn't sick consistently, and it seemed to come in sporadic waves. On January 11th, 2000, 12-year-old Ashley came home from school with her sister and found her father on the couch. Ashley called her mother at work and said that her father was acting weird and making funny faces. Stacy came home and found Michael unconscious. Stacy called an ambulance, and though first responders were able to restore a pulse en route to the hospital, Michael Wallace was pronounced deceased before arriving. Doctors said that Michael had died from a heart attack and didn't deem the death as suspicious. However, Michael was only 35, and other than the mysterious medical issues, he had been extremely healthy. His family wanted an autopsy performed, but Stacy refused. Now a widow at 29, Stacy buried her husband with a quick funeral and moved on with her life. After Michael's death, Stacy became a distant parent. Though she had never been a very hands-on mom, being a single parent gave her new freedoms. In addition to a bit of life insurance money of $55,000, she was able to relax from the responsibilities of parenthood and being a wife. In 2001, she was introduced to David Castor. David was everything her first husband had not been. David was responsible, he didn't drink, he didn't party, and he was financially stable, owning his own company. David was recently divorced and had an adult son from his first marriage. The two were married in 2003, and Stacy took over much of the business as his office manager. The two didn't have a passionate marriage, but it seemed to bring the two comfort. Stacy enjoyed financial stability, and David had companionship. An odd aspect of the relationship was that David didn't want any more children and didn't make it a secret that he resented having to share his life with two young girls. He'd made it clear that he had one son and he wasn't interested in being a father figure to the Wallace girls. The weekend before David's death, the couple got into an argument, allegedly over how they were going to spend their second wedding anniversary. Stacy sent the girls away to a friend's house, and the couple continued arguing until she left as well. Stacy told investigators that David had been depressed over his father's recent passing, though those who knew David felt that the story was unlike the man that they knew. There were two glasses on the nightstand in with David, one filled with neon green liquid and the other brandy. There was also an empty bottle of cranberry juice. The green fluid was determined to be antifreeze, which is highly toxic, and an open bottle of antifreeze was located near the bed. Medical examiners did an autopsy and signed off that David had died from ethylene glycol poisoning, and it was ruled as a suicide, but detectives continued to investigate the suspicious death. An examination of the home revealed some interesting things. First, the glass containing the antifreeze had 3 fingerprints, all belonging to Stacy. Second, they found a turkey baster in the garbage can. On the turkey baster, they found trace amounts of David's saliva on the tip, as well as antifreeze. Additionally, it had been wiped of any fingerprints. Once the medical examiners released David's body, Stacy had another quick funeral, and much to the shock of family members from both her first and second husband, she buried David next to Michael. Then Stacy moved on with her life, utterly oblivious to any investigation going on. David's son was shocked to learn that his father had left everything to Stacy, and was further surprised when Stacy sold his father's company and everything else in his estate. She made off better with the death of her second husband, with nearly $200,000. It would take detectives a year to get enough evidence together to establish probable cause, at which point they were able to get approval for the exhumation of Michael Wallace. Detectives felt that if they could find evidence of ethylene glycol poisoning in Mike, it would all but confirm that Stacy had killed both of her husbands. When Michael was exhumed, an autopsy was performed, and it was clear he had not died of a heart attack. Ethylene glycol causes crystals to form in your organs and blood, and it has a telltale sign. And the telltale signs were in both men. Nearly 2 years into the investigation, detectives had enough to hone in on Stacy. Surveillance was approved. First, her cell phone and landlines were tapped, and security cameras were put in to watch the house. Detectives hoped to shake up Stacy and get her to say something incriminating. They showed up at her home on September 22, 2007 to question her about the death of David, purposely leaving out that they had exhumed and autopsied her first husband, Michael. Stacy was very caught off guard and confused. She had no idea that she had been investigated and knew immediately what the detectives were angling for with their line of questioning. During the questioning, she had said two things that stood out. One was that she had mentioned watching a show with David where a wife killed two of her husbands by poisoning them with antifreeze, and that's where she felt like she got the idea from. And the second was when the lead detective asked her to point to which glass she had poured the cranberry juice in for David, and she said, "I poured the cranberry juice." Detectives were shocked that she had more or less admitted to pouring the antifreeze into the cup. After she said that, she asked for a lawyer and the interview stopped. Detective knew they had successfully shaken her up and hoped that the wiretaps would be the final piece to make an arrest.
I took this picture of one like it out of my folder, and I showed it to Stacy and said I had a question for you. Stacy, regarding these glasses that were on top of the nightstand next to David's bed, you told us earlier that you had gotten David some cranberry juice and some water. By looking at the photo, would you be able to tell me which glass it was that you brought into David? Stacy leaned into the photo, was looking at it, at which time she said, "When I poured the the cranberry juice, you're confusing me, you're jumping all over the place." At that point I said, "Stacy, I simply asked you one question. I didn't jump all over, it was just one question, if you know which glass it was." At that point, the interview continued.
When she said to you, "When I poured the antifree," are you certain it was antifree and not antifreeze with a Z?
It was antifree, absolutely positive.
Meanwhile, they went and interviewed Ashley, Stacy's oldest daughter, who was now at college. Ashley was shocked by detectives' allegations about her mother. She didn't believe them and told them that what they were saying was ridiculous. When detectives left, Ashley immediately called her mother to ask about the detectives, but during the calls, nothing incriminating was said. Officers continued to monitor the phone lines, and just as it was starting to seem like a waste of time, a 911 call was placed from Stacy's home.
My daughter, I believe, has taken some pills.
Is she conscious?
Yes, she's normally okay. I'm leaning over her. Ashley, she's having trouble, I think. It sounds like there's something in her throat. Ashley.
According to Stacy, she had just found her daughter overdosed on pills. Ambulances rushed over and were able to pump Ashley's stomach and get her stable. They determined that she had overdosed on prescription painkillers, and had it even been a few minutes more, she likely would have died. Ashley said she woke up to her mother by her side, but she was very foggy and couldn't understand what people were saying at first. She floated in and out of consciousness for several hours, and when she woke again, there was a detective. The detective informed her that she had attempted suicide, and in her note, she had confessed to killing her father and stepfather. Ashley was shocked and told the officer she had no idea what he was talking about. She told detectives that the last thing she remembered was being with her mom. She said that her mom had called her and asked her to come over for drinks. She said that her mom had made her a mixed drink of vodka, orange juice, and Sprite, and she remembered it tasting weird, but Stacy had convinced her it was fine. After she drank the drink, she recalled getting very tired and going to bed. She said that she trusted her mom and had no reason to suspect anything sinister. Fortunately for Ashley, detectives had a mounting case against Stacy already, and Ashley was believed. Detectives were sure that Stacy had poisoned Ashley in an attempt to place blame onto her daughter and shift suspicion from her. There was also evidence to support Ashley. The note, for example, had been typed up on a computer and didn't have a written signature. A forensic analysis of the note also determined that it had been written and printed from Stacy's computer. It had undergone several revisions, all auto-saved in Microsoft Word, and the timestamps were when Ashley had been in class. Ashley would also have only been 11 at the time of her father's death and hadn't been home when David had died. Despite Stacy's attempt to divert suspicion, there was no evidence to connect Ashley to either crime, and Stacy now had an attempted murder charge added to her list of crimes. Stacy was arrested at the hospital and was charged with 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Because Michael had been murdered in a different jurisdiction, she wasn't charged with his murder. During her trial, prosecutors brought David's will into question. Detectives discovered that Stacy had forged the will that had been used to settle David's estate. Money seemed to be the motive in David's killing. On March 5, 2009, Stacy Castor was found guilty of the murder of her second husband, David, and also guilty for the attempted murder of her daughter, Ashley. She was given the maximum sentence of 25 years for both charges, with the addition of 1 year for the forging of David's will, for a total of 51 years in prison. Neither Ashley nor Bree had anything to do with their mother after she had been arrested. In 2011, David's son sued Stacy for the remainder of his father's estate and won. In 2010, an investigation was also opened into the mysterious death of Stacy's father. Nothing came of the investigation as he'd been cremated, but the detectives noted that Stacy had been named the sole heir in his estate. Though he had been ill for some time before his death, he had been recovering well until he received a visit from his daughter, Stacy. In 2016, Stacy Castor died in prison. She was 48, and according to the prison she had been in, she had died of a heart attack. Following Stacy's death, the Castor family petitioned to move David's body so that Stacy could not be buried next to David as per her will had stated. They successfully moved David, and she was instead buried next to her first husband, Michael.
All right, Ms. Everly, I have your note that the jury's reached a verdict. If you'd stand for a moment. On indictment number 2007-1271-1, the people of the state of New York versus Stacy R. Castor, as to count number 1, murder in the second degree, what is the verdict?
Guilty.
On count 2, attempted murder in the second degree, what's the verdict?
Guilty.
And on count 3, offering a false instrument in the first degree, what is the jury's verdict?
Guilty.
All right. Do you wish the jury polled, Bill? Chuck?
Yes, Judge.
All right. Kelly, go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as stated through your foreperson, you have found the defendant guilty of all 3 counts in the indictment. Juror number 1, is that your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 2?
Yes.
Juror number 3? Yes. Juror number 4? Yes. Juror number 5?
Yes.
Juror number 6?
Yes.
Juror number 7?
Yes.
Juror number 8?
Yes.
Juror number 9?
Yes.
Juror number 10?
Yes.
Juror number 11?
Yes.
And juror number 12?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of both parties and myself and the people of Onondaga County, I want to take this opportunity to thank you and you folks who are alternates, your patience too over the last several days when you haven't been able to deliberate. I'm very, very grateful for your patience and your understanding also. Your jury service is over. You're certainly free to go with our thanks. You're free to talk to anybody about the case that you wish, whether it be the lawyers, the press, each other, your families. But I want to thank you really with very sincerely, and I hope stay warm.
Thank you, ladies. I'd like to check if you don't mind.
Visalia was a community first hit by who would become the Golden State Killer, but at the time of these crimes he was known as the Visalia Ransacker. He honed his skills here. It was where he took his first life, and investigators knew he was building to something more violent even early on. Visalia would be plagued with a violent prowler for nearly 2 years before he disappeared. In 1974, reports began coming in about a prowler in the small farm town of Visalia, California. There had been multiple sightings of a prowler in the neighborhood of South Desmarais Street. A few weeks later, a house would be ransacked. Little was stolen, mostly just keepsakes such as piggy banks, class rings, engraved jewelry, personalized items, or small collections like coins or stamps. A distinguishing calling card was that he would steal one earring from a pair or a single cufflink. The items he took were sometimes found nearby or in the next home he ransacked. He also stole any weapons in the house, firearms, ammunition, knives, tools, and even a billy club. This immediately led investigators to believe he was already gravitating towards violence. Occasionally, he would only steal more practical items that seemed to be used for his personal use, such as packages of shirts, glue, canned foods, dishes, and a stereo. He would often leave higher valued items, including money left in plain sight. He would hit homes where homeowners were out of town. He would lurk in the same neighborhood for weeks before deciding on a target. Investigators noticed that the house would have identical shoe prints. The shoe prints would be under windows, paced around the backyard, and often establish routes. This patient and calm attitude was a sign that he did this to satisfy a different craving. He would often enter the home through an unlocked window. Sometimes it would be slipping a lock or forcing open a sliding glass door. Once he gained entrance into a home, he would create multiple escape points by opening additional windows, pulling off screens. This was so he could have an easy exit if someone entered the house unexpectedly. And it also made hearing outside noises easier. Cars passing, people walking, dogs barking, all indicators that he had been spotted. Once he was comfortable in the home, he would then begin ransacking. He would open every drawer, cupboard, and closet. He would collect up women's undergarments, arranging them in particular ways and in a deliberate fashion. He would take photographs out of frames and stimulate himself using lotion found in the home, or sometimes he would bring his own, additionally smearing lotion all around the house. He would often cause minimal damage to the homes, knocking over bookshelves or pouring wine onto the carpet, or dumping liquids onto furniture. He would often ransack multiple homes in one night, and on November 30th, 1974, there were 12 separate incidences connected to the Visalia ransacker. Although he was rarely seen, there were a few witnesses. He was described as a Caucasian man with a fair complexion and light hair, a young adult, average height, stocky build, and a cleft in his chin. He was described as physically fit, as he was able to scale walls, with witnesses saying he had strong arms and a firm grip. The most common way people described him was that he had a plump baby face and a thick neck. He was seen wearing jeans and tennis shoes, which matched the shoe prints at the scenes, and his shoe size was a men's 9. By 1995, his crimes began to escalate. In the early morning hours on September 11th, 1975, a man entered the home of the Snelling family while they slept. Claude Snelling woke, hearing strange noises. He was already on edge, having confronted a prowler peeping into his daughter's window 7 months prior. He opened the door to his bedroom and saw the sliding glass doors leading to the backyard were wide open. He ran to the door and saw a man attempting to kidnap his daughter. He shouted and ran at the man but was shot twice. The gun pierced the silence in the early morning. The assailant fled the scene, escaping in a wooded area behind the home. Claude died of his wounds, and his daughter would later undergo hypnotherapy to try and remember as many details about the man who had killed her father. She remembered that the night before, she had heard a noise outside her window. She had looked, but it was too dark to see anything. She remembered being woken up to an immense pressure on top of her body. It was a man lying on top of her. The man had a hand over her nose and mouth. When she struggled to breathe, the man growled, "Don't scream, or I'll stab you." She stayed quiet, and he removed his hand from her face and growled again, "You're coming with me." It was then that he stood up and showed her he had a gun. He kept a hold of her arm, and when she asked him, "Why are you doing this? Where are you taking me?" But he didn't answer. She began crying and resisting to slow him down, knowing nothing good could happen if she left the house. He redirected from threatening her to threatening her family. She noticed he had left the back door open already. She dug her heels into the carpet as hard as she could, which made a loud noise. This was what woke her father. The man had started dragging her out of the house. She was already a dozen feet into the yard and through a gate that had been left open, and under the car park when she heard her father's voice yell at the man holding her arm. She made eye contact with her father, and for a moment everyone stopped. Her father lunged and the attacker shot, and then was gone. It had all happened so fast. The weapon Claude was murdered with was determined to be a Morocco revolver that had been stolen by the Visalia ransacker just 2 weeks before the murder. The Snells neighborhood had also had multiple incidences of evidence of the prowler, and vehicles being broken into before the shooting. After the Snelling murder, nighttime stakeouts began in the neighborhoods the prowler had previously been sighted in, but the ransackings continued. On December 10, 1975, Officer Bill McGowan on stakeout saw a shadowy figure appear near a garage where he'd been hiding during the stakeouts. The garage had purposely been left open by the police. There was another officer inside the garage. He watched as the figure crept around the hedge and peeked into the garage. The prowler made his way along the home towards the backyard. Officer McGowan quietly followed him and observed the prowler toying with the lock on the back gate. That was when he clicked the flashlight on the prowler's head. The prowler shrieked in a high-pitched, unnatural voice, "Oh my God." He had been wearing a ski mask or stocking rolled up onto his head. Officer McGowan got a good look at the suspect and yelled, "Police officer, hold it right there." The suspect vaulted over the gate and took off running in a zigzag pattern through the yard. Officer McGowan ordered the suspect to stop and put his hands out, but when he kept running, he pursued. The suspect continued to scream, "Oh my God, please don't hurt me," in a bizarre, high-pitched and oddly feminine voice. The officer fired a warning shot, which also alerted his partner. The suspect hopped over fences with an intimate knowledge of the area. The man stopped running only 5 feet from the officer and put a hand up, his back facing the officer. His other hand began rummaging through his coat pockets. Before the officer could react, the suspect spun around and fired a shot. Officer McGowan fell, and the suspect ran off.
I fell down, the impact knocked me back, and he continued to run, throwing some items apparently taken a burglary in the area.
He obviously didn't take the full run of that bullet that he fired. What happened there?
Yeah, the projectile went into the end of my flashlight, which is the Cal light, the big metal one, and went through several batteries and lodged in the back portion of the flashlight.
The Visalia ransacker eluded police that night. Despite the entire police force tracking his prints and using police dogs, McGowan was able to add to the description that he drew his weapon and shot with his left hand. He worked with the sketch artist to come up with these images. Officer McGowan served as the member of the Visalia Police Department for many years, where he retired after a long and honorable career. Even in his retirement, he continued to help the Visalia ransacking case, and after he passed, his son went on to continue his work. After this incident, the ransacking in Visalia stopped. The investigation for the Visalia ransacker remained to be the most expensive in Visalia's history. His crimes in this era of his life amounted to 1 murder, 1 attempted kidnapping, 1 attempted murder, and over 100 burglaries. He was active as early as 1973, and police are now trying to connect him to burglaries in Exeter, California, which had begun in 1968, and a spree of robberies dubbed the Cordova Cat Burglar. At the moment, however, there is no evidence linking him to these, but the MO is the same as the Visalia ransacker, which is why it is without a doubt all crimes were committed by the same man.
Teenage girl was raped today in her home in Contra Costa County, and though officials are not saying it was the work of the East Area rapist, they do say the crime was committed in his style. Betty Ann Bruno has more.
Law enforcement officials from every police agency in Contra Costa County tonight are looking for the man who raped a 13-year-old Walnut Creek girl early this morning. The young victim was attacked in her Rancho San Miguel home. Police say she described her attacker as a white male, 6 feet tall, weighing 185 pounds.
Was wearing some type of a mask or a hood. I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. He apparently was in the residence for approximately 45 minutes. We don't know how he gained entry. She was bound. He raped her. He didn't bother anyone else in the residence, and the young girl's father and older sister were inside the residence at the time, were unaware of the attack.
Johnson said her assailant may be the East Area rapist who is suspected of committing at least 4 other rapes in the same area, or he may be an imitator. Police are urging everyone in the Concord, Walnut Creek, and San Ramon area to be on the lookout and to report strangers in their neighborhoods who seem to be just hanging around or displaying any other suspicious behavior. This is Betty Ann Bruno in Walnut Creek for the 10 o'clock news.
Rancho Cordova, a suburb in the Sacramento area in the early 1970s, was considered a sleepy and safe residential area to raise a family. In the 1950s, Aerojet had opened its headquarters there, which was causing a suburban housing boom, turning the open vineyards into neatly organized neighborhoods of single-story homes. However, it wasn't a perfect community. Memories from the 70s were littered with both positive hot summer days spent by the river and those that weren't so fondly looked upon, homelessness and drugs. By far, though, one needs only mention a name to stop folks who grew up in that area in the 70s dead in their tracks: the East Area Rapist, or EAR. This was the first community he plagued with escalating violence. It meant something to him, as even when they thought he had moved on to a different area, he would keep coming back. Many who investigated had believed that this was where he lived, his home. His first attack was on June 18, 1976. A call came into the Rancho Cordova Police Department at 5 a.m. from a 23-year-old woman. She had managed to walk backwards, knock the phone onto the floor, searching for 0 with numb fingers. Her hands were tied behind her back, tied so tightly that she had lost circulation. She was calling to report a home invasion and sexual assault. She told police she had been awoken to a man standing in her doorway. She had initially thought she was dreaming, thinking to herself, "Who wears a ski mask in Sacramento in June?" before realizing the danger before her. She noted that the mask was strange. It was white with a coarse knit-like material with eye holes cut out and a seam down the middle. She also noted he was about 5'9", moderately muscular, wearing a blue t-shirt and gray canvas gloves. She also noted he had very pale legs with dark hair, and he wasn't wearing pants, breathing heavily, and holding a knife. "If you make one move or sound, I'll stick this knife into you," he whispered. He had brought rope and tied her hands, but then opted to take a sash from her closet and use it to tie her hands instead. In between assaults, she could hear him in the house ransacking. From her bedroom, she could hear him opening drawers and rifling through her contents. He spoke in a low, guttural whisper through clenched teeth. He had cut her above her brow, which she felt was an accident, but police had concerns about testing his limits for violence. In the weeks leading up to the attacks, what would later be noted as a trend. His first victim had seen an older, dark, medium-sized car drive by her house several times. She could never make out the face, but it felt like she was being watched. She had also started to receive frequent hang-up calls. Police had initially thought that the attacker was some kid, a punk who would be caught quickly, but there was something about this rapist that was different from others. He was careful not to remove his gloves. He had meticulously learned his victim's schedule. Although the house had been thoroughly ransacked, he had only stolen relatively low-value items. He would continue this trend, attacking single women who lived alone or with small children. He would bounce around different suburbs in Sacramento, Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, and Citrus Heights. It would follow a similar pattern. calls of a prowler, shoe prints spotted under windowsills, homes being ransacked. Still nothing of value was stolen. Repeated dropped calls, occasionally those who answered the phone heard breathing, sometimes threats like, "I'll kill your husband."
Hello? Hello?
In 1976, he totaled 10 victims. His fifth victim, Jane Carson, recalled cuddling her son in the early morning hours on October 5th, when she heard someone running down the hall. Her husband, a captain in the Air Force, had just left for work moments ago, and she had assumed he had forgotten something. "Jack, is that you? Did you forget something?" A man wearing a ski mask entered the room. He was holding a butcher's knife. Jane had been sitting up in bed, her 3-year-old sleeping next to her. "Shut up, or I'll kill you. I just want your money," he whispered through clenched teeth. "Okay, whatever you want," Jane complied. He bound, blindfolded, and gagged both Jane and her son. He then picked up the child and moved him to another room. Jane was now in a full-on panic, not knowing where her child was. He repeatedly told her to shut up. She said he must have told her at least 50 times. He assaulted her, but before he left, he returned her son onto the bed beside her. When she knew the intruder had left the house, she ran to the neighbors and got help. The attacker had entered the home through her son's bedroom window, only moments after her husband had left. And only 2 weeks prior to the attack, they had been a victim to a strange burglary, where the intruder had also entered through their son's bedroom window. The thief had taken 10 rings, but had left behind some jewelry that had been stolen from their neighbor's house. Police had been sure it was the same guy whose primary objective had never been theft. Jane and her husband hadn't been concerned about a rapist in the area. There had been a media blackout at the time regarding the crimes of the East Area Rapist. Jane would later tell media outlets that she would have taken more considerable precautions had the police been more open about what they had known about the attacks. Rumors had swirled about the attacks because of the blackout. The police couldn't dispute the stories, and strange details began to emerge about the ear mutilating victims. He began targeting more affluent neighborhoods, perhaps because of the lack of accurate press about him. He attacked twice in one night. One of the victims was a housewife in Carmichael. Police felt he was pushing into the nicer neighborhoods to get more attention. In the 1970s, there was a dramatic uptick in crime in California. Most detectives who worked that decade referred to it as the dark times. His first crimes had been reported, but once police realized they were dealing with a serial rapist, they opted to enforce a media blackout not to validate him with the press or scare him off from the region. October had brought 3 more attacks after Jane's. The 1970s was a time long before they had dedicated departments to sex crimes. Long before there was criminal profiling, terms like signature behaviors and rituals were often used to distinguish offenders from one another. In Jane's attack, like the attacks before, he had cut her just on the shoulder. Police believed he was suppressing an urge to inflict more pain. In the assaults following James, he had begun clicking scissors and threatening to cut off toes. He would stab the bed next to victims, and psychological torment became a new signature of the ear. He would often use their names, mention personal information, such as their high school, to torment them, making them believe that they knew their attacker. He would stand silently, sometimes for hours, making victims believe he had left before making a noise to indicate he was still there. The ear was always described the same: white, 5'9", late teens, early 20s, medium athletic build, clenched whisper, small penis. He spoke hurriedly, but physically moved in an entirely leisurely way. He would drape towels over TVs or lamps. Lighting seemed to be necessary, and he had particular psychosexual needs. He would often bind his victim multiple times and would use different materials. He never fondled the victims and would question the victims while assaulting. He had asked Jane, "Is this like the captain's?" while he had been raping her. While he was assaulting her, he would snap at her directions. "Put some emotion into that," he would order, "or I'll use my knife." It hadn't been typical for a ski-masked rapist to be so devoted to recon. This was the police's most significant concern. They were dealing with someone different, something they had never seen before. After his attack in Carmichael, 500 people attended a town hall regarding the attacks on November 3rd. The following day, the Bee, a local newspaper, published an article about the 8 attacks that had occurred so far in 1976. The detectives awkwardly fielded questions they had no answers to, and reminded people to be vigilant in their neighborhoods. They had never anticipated so many people to attend.
Law enforcement officials from every police agency in Contra Costa County tonight are looking for the man who raped a 13-year-old Walnut Creek girl early this morning. The young victim was attacked in her Rancho San Miguel home. Police say she described her attacker as a white male, 6 feet tall, weighing 185 pounds.
He was wearing some type of a mask or a hood. He was wearing shorts and a T-shirt. He apparently was in the residence for approximately 45 minutes. We don't know how he gained entry. She was bound. He raped her. He didn't bother anyone else in the residence, and the young girl's father and older sister were inside the residence at the time, were unaware of the attack.
A teenage victim watched TV in the den of her family home when a man came up behind her. 1977 marked a turning point for the ear. The Sacramento Bee did an article warning single women and how to protect themselves, and they wrote, "The East Area Rapist will never attack while a man is in the house." After that article, almost as if it had been a challenge, the Ear began targeting couples. He read the news articles written about him, and if they noted a particular trend, he would adapt. Some speculated he would even change his appearance. If it was written he was pale, in his next attacks, they would be carried out by a much more tanned man. His hair went from long to short. He was continually adapting. His attack on couples was an escalation point in the Ear's criminal career. There were 11 attacks in a row. He would get the female to bind the man and separate the two. After bringing the woman to the living room, he would force the men on all fours and stack teacups and saucers on their backs, saying, "If I hear these rattle or crash, I'll kill her." The attacks would look the same: shoelace bindings and wrists tied so tight they were bruised, empty beer cans and food eaten. He took his time, often staying in the house for hours after assaulting the victim multiple times. He would ransack the house, opening cupboards and drawers, stealing engraved jewelry and stamp or coin collections, photos, occasionally money, but never taking anything valuable. Some items would be found later, dumped somewhere nearby. He had told one victim he had been in the Army. This had already been a line of theories from detectives. There were 4 military bases around Sacramento and 1 Air Force base. Many of his victims described his demeanor as someone who had a background in the armed forces. They recognized the methods he used. He would open up multiple exits, stalking the potential victims for weeks. The dishes trick was a technique commonly used in the Vietnam War. He would also turn off air conditioning units to hear better, in addition to his preference for knives and how proficient he was with knots. There was also the suspicion that the Ear was one of them. He was always one step ahead of the police. Treetop cameras were placed in neighborhoods officers thought he would likely attack. They had depleted their entire overtime budget for the year by April, having additional patrol cars, and floodlights were installed in most neighborhoods. Homeowners began trimming back shrubbery and trees to maximize visibility. If the police were focusing on one area, the ear would strike in another one. He also seemed more knowledgeable in police techniques than the average citizen. He wore gloves, and he seemed to know where police were patrolling and when. He had even shouted at a victim to freeze as she had been trying to scurry to the telephone. They never seemed to be able to catch a break. The police of Sacramento began cutting tree limbs, removing shrubbery, anything that could hide a prowler. People were installing floodlights and lighting up entire neighborhoods. Over 3,000 guns were sold in 3 months. Households began sleeping in shifts or not sleeping at all in the hours between 1 and 5 a.m. People started putting bars on their windows, and people would gather in neighborhoods for neighborhood watch stakeouts. No one was safe, and it seemed the whole community was on high alert. On May 17, 1977, police were called to Carmichael. A man stood on the side of the road with a shoelace dangling from his wrist. The man spoke in a thick Italian accent, and the officer Richard Shelby recognized him immediately. He had been at the town hall meeting about the attacker 6 months previously, and he had loudly spoken out about the East Area Rapist and the investigators. The ear had been at the meeting. He had seemingly chosen this victim as a challenge. After what was the 42nd attack in Dansville, investigators were searching an area that a neighbor had reported seeing a suspicious vehicle in the previous day, and they discovered 3 sheets of paper torn out of a notebook. The first sheet appeared to be some homework, part of an essay on General George Armstrong Custer. The other sheet was a journal-styled writing about how the author had been made to write lines by their teacher and how angry it made him. The letter was called "Mad is the Word." Although it is unclear if it belonged to the ear, investigators did use it to attempt to find a suspect. The author specified having a male teacher, and assuming he went to school and was a local in the area, there hadn't been a lot of male teachers at that time. But this didn't turn up any new leads. The last page was a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be a suburban neighborhood with the word punishment scrawled on the reverse. They couldn't determine what neighborhood it was, but it revealed that the artist had a strong knowledge of architectural layout and landscape design. Police then began to look into anyone who may have done security for development projects, or cartographers, anyone who would have had a valid reason for being in a neighborhood for extended periods of time. A lot of the areas the ear hit were usually adjacent to building developments. Brian Maggiore was out for a walk with his wife Katie and their dog. The couple were in high spirits celebrating a promotion where Brian, an administrative specialist with the Air Force, had just received word that he was being posted to Germany. It was about 9 p.m. and they were only blocks from their apartment in Rancho Cordova, where they encountered a man prowling in the dark. It is believed that Brian chased the prowler into a nearby backyard. Brian, who was 6'1" and had a good 50 pounds on the prowler, was closing in on the suspect when the prowler produced a gun and shot Brian in the chest. The prowler then came around the house and chased down Katie, who was running away, and fired. She was shot fatally. It was initially thought to be unrelated to the ear, but at the scene, a pre-tied binding made of shoelaces were found near a window of a nearby home. The young couple, only in their early 20s murder, rocked the already terrified community. A witness looked out a window witnessing the entire scene. They were able to describe the shooter as wearing a ski mask, wearing a brown leather jacket with dark, quiet shoes. At this point, the ear only killed out of necessity, only in times when he felt there was no other way out. The Maggiore's murders marked his second escalation of violence, resulting in death. During his attacks, he began telling victims he would start killing. He would say that he wanted them to relay messages to the police, and that he wanted to read that message in the papers the next morning. There was a break in the summer in 1978. His last attack had been in June, and for a while everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Police began being reassigned to new cases, hopeful that the man terrorizing Sacramento was in prison or had died. Their hopes were quickly discarded as attacks started the following October. His attacks began to stray further and further from Rancho Cordova, stretching south to San Jose, then suddenly back to Rancho Cordova, and back down to Walnut Creek. The summer of 1979 also saw a break. Like he began to take summers off, only to start again in the fall. Police believe there was a strong connection to an academic calendar as he took significant breaks between July and October, and attacks never happened on school holidays.
I didn't hear him come in, I didn't hear anything, and all of a sudden there was someone standing in my door, the bedroom door, and I looked up and I thought it was my dad at first, because he drives weird hours and he might have come in early because it was early in the morning. And nope, it wasn't my dad. So he came in, he had a ski mask on, and jumped on the bed and had a knife. And I don't exactly remember what he said, but something to the effect of, don't scream, don't, whatever. And tied my hands behind my back. He put a cut over my eye, but I didn't even realize that it had been cut. And I guess part of what he said is that, I don't know what he said. I just remember feeling extremely threatened. After it was all over and done with, he went through the stuff in the room, took money out of my purse, took some coin books and stuff that I had, and took a piece of jewelry. It was just something that I had just gotten. I don't even know what it was. And I laid in the bed for, it seemed like forever, because I'd never heard, I was waiting for the door to close, and I never heard the door close. So I was afraid to get up to see, and finally I said, okay, this is do or die. I don't hold it against him. There's something wrong with him.
Sacramento's East Area rapist has been active for 16 months, 15 victims. At first, a single investigator worked the case full-time. Now, several people are involved. The pressure to catch this man has been mounting, but a multi-rapist often acts on impulse.
Most of the multiple rapists attack on impulse, and so they have no predetermined point of attack. There is no way to calculate a pattern of where they're going to strike next, or the type of place they're going to strike next, or who their next victim is going to be.
Many of those involved with the case say the East Area rapist lives within the area where he operates, that he picks upon blocks of homes within neighborhoods, jumping from one to the other. One of his few mistakes was to attack a woman who lived only one block inside Sacramento's city limits and then steal her car, which only brought in the city's rape detail and 4 more people to work toward catching him. It takes a while for a community to wake up. Sacramento was no exception. By late fall, when the East Area rapist began claiming 2 and 3 victims a month, citizens began buying everything they could think of to protect themselves. Gun sales are way up, with some of the buyers not that familiar with how to use firearms, and that can be dangerous.
In the summer of 1979, he took a second summer break in a row. In the fall, he had moved to Southern California in the Santa Barbara area. At first, his series of crimes were not initially linked to the East Area rapist. It wasn't until much later that the crimes were linked via DNA evidence. He was dubbed the Night Stalker, but serial killer Richard Ramirez had also received the same nickname, so to differentiate between the two, our killer was given the prefix Original. October 1st, 1979, in Goleta, the weather was hot and humid, and a young couple slept with their windows open, trying to capture a breeze. They woke not to the uncomfortable temperature of the room, but a blinding flashlight pointed at their faces. A voice from beyond the light ordered them to roll over on their stomachs. Then he ordered the woman to tie up her boyfriend using a ligature tossed at her. The man growled orders at her in a strange, forced whisper to tie it tight, or she would be killed. The man then tied her. Neither of them got a good look at the intruder. The man demanded money and began rummaging through drawers and slamming them shut. What seemed like a century later, he returned to the room. He forced the woman onto her feet and walked her into the living room. He then forced her on the floor. He threw a pair of shorts over her head to prevent her watching his movements. He went to the kitchen to continue opening and closing drawers and cupboards, then the fridge. He sounded like he was pacing and began chanting to himself, "I'll kill them, I'll kill them, I'll kill them," like he needed to encourage himself. While he paced and chanted, the woman managed to wiggle out of her bindings and sprint out of the house. She screamed that kind of blood-curdling scream that movies can never quite capture, alerting her neighbors. Her boyfriend, still in the bedroom, had been able to hop out of the back door. When he got close to the shrubbery in the backyard, he dropped and rolled under an orange tree, narrowly missing a frantic beam of flashlight, searching. The next-door neighbor of the couple was an FBI agent. He had been enjoying the quiet evening trying to finish a book when he was alerted to the screams. He grabbed his firearm and ran out to the front yard. In his peripheral, he saw movement, and his vision flicked to a man furiously biking away from the chaos. The neighbor got in his car and pursued the man. The man dumped the bike along with a steak knife and dove between houses. The agent attempted to maintain vision but eventually gave up. The couple only had a vague description of the suspect. White, dark hair, maybe 5'10" or 11. The FBI agent didn't have much to add. He hadn't been wearing a mask, and he wore a plaid shirt, jeans, and tennis shoes. The agent received a lot of backlash from local cops for not shooting the assailant, but he stood his ground, saying he didn't know what had happened in the house yet, if there was a weapon, or if he was even the suspect that had attacked his neighbors. He didn't feel he could open fire based on the information he had at the time. This also was the first attack in the area, and he had no idea this would be the first in many murders. The bike had been stolen from a nearby home, and the steak knife had come from the couple's kitchen. The couple themselves had been confident that the intruder had every intention of killing them, and had he not given them time to get away, he would have succeeded. He never made that mistake again. After this, there are no more witness accounts of his crimes. There are only crime scene reconstructions. He struck next in Goleta on December 30th, 1979, and his victims were Dr. Robert Offman and his new girlfriend, Dr. Barbara Manning. Then a married couple, Charlene and Lyman Smith, in March 1980, in the Ventura area. Lyman was to be appointed as a judge, and the police felt it was a targeted attack. Charlene had an unusual knot used to bind her wrists. This briefly brought him the moniker the Diamond Knot Killer. In August, it was another married couple, Keith and Patrice Harrington, in Dana Point. The following victim was in Irvine. She had been home alone and thought to be bludgeoned to death. She was married, but her husband was in the hospital at the time. Although he had a solid alibi, he was still a lead suspect in her murder. Years later, his second wife would say that they would often receive hang-up calls and occasional threats for many years following. She truly felt that she would be next. Even decades after the last attack, victims would often be tormented with hang-up calls or taunts like, "Remember when we played?" He enjoyed their change of tone when they recognized his voice. He wanted them to know he was still out there, alive, free. One victim could hear a woman and children in the background and knew he was out there, living a life with his family. Investigators were sure he still lived locally. One woman had started a new job waitressing at Denny's. During a seemingly uneventful shift, she answered the restaurant's phone, and the caller threatened to attack her again. Police theorized that her attacker had coincidentally been at the restaurant. Around Christmas, one victim picked up the phone one day and the caller said, "Merry Christmas, it's me again." His crimes in the 1980s became fewer and further between. At this point, it is unclear if there are more crimes attributed to him that aren't connected yet, or perhaps he had a change in personal life that was putting a damper on his ability to be as prolific as he had once been. In July of 1981, there were 2 more victims, bringing the total of his South California crimes to 10 and 11. Sherry Domingo was temporarily staying in a deceased relative's house while it was in the process of being sold. Her boyfriend, Greg Sanchez, was also a victim. The two had been separated for several months when he went to see her for dinner. This attack, more than the others, seemed like a crime of opportunity. Greg was young, fit, and based on the scene, it looked like he gave one hell of a fight. He suffered a gunshot wound to his cheek and continued to fight on, but ultimately he was bludgeoned to death. This would be the Ear's last attack on a couple. A piece of evidence had renewed hopes for capture. Flecks of paint recovered at the scene. The Calais Real shopping center was being developed around the time of the murders. The development was in its final stages of construction at the time of the Offerman Manning murders, which would have included painting. However, this lead didn't pan out either. Taking on couples was posing to be more of a challenge than earlier on in his career. He was now having too many close calls. People fighting for their lives weren't as easy to incapacitate. The men kept getting closer and closer to gaining the upper hand. After the Domingo Sanchez murders, he disappeared for 5 years. His last known victim was a teenager named Janelle Cruz. Her family were on vacation in Mexico, and Janelle was at home alone. She had been assaulted and beaten with such overkill that she was unrecognizable. This case wasn't thought to have been connected, but it was linked by DNA years later. It had broken a 5-year hiatus, and Janelle had seemingly no connection to any of his other victims in the area. Janelle had multiple men coming in and out of her life, and it had seemed that one of them had killed her in a jealous rage. But the evidence couldn't connect any of them. Janelle's house was less than 2 miles from the 7th murder, so it was likely he had stalked the area before. It, like many other victims' homes, backed onto a drainage canal. Police had one suspect in mind for the Southern California murders. He was a Goleta local, a career criminal, but he was killed when he had tried to buy guns and drugs in Mexico, and it had been a setup. He died in 1982, and the slaying of Janelle Cruz in '86 eliminated him as a suspect. They had been so confident it had been a resident of Goleta. They had never really looked elsewhere. Like the crimes in Rancho Cordova, Goleta had a San Jose Creek running adjacent to the residential neighborhoods. The first 3 houses he hit ran along the creek. It had provided a prowler with ample coverage to observe unnoticed in the dark, allowing him to bypass the need to venture into the neighborhoods and risk being seen or captured. Much like his other crimes in Sacramento, there were also tiny details that indicated his presence, only realized in retrospect. Janelle Cruz was the final victim. Many investigators were sure he was dead. There had been a burglar who had been shot by an armed homeowner, and they had hoped he had been their guy. Sexual predators never truly stop. They have to be stopped. He began to be forgotten about. No one wrote about the unsolved, unconnected crimes for decades. His crimes were pervasive, and he impacted so many lives. He was once a boogeyman, plaguing communities for years only to disappear. Even in making these videos, multiple people have commented detailing how their lives had been changed forever. 20 years after the crimes had been committed, most of the evidence had been destroyed. This was routine evidence room procedure. Cases that had passed the statute of limitations needed to make space for newer evidence. However, some labs kept all of their evidence on the ear, hopefully that one day it would be required for a trial. Paul Holes, a criminal analyst-turned-investigator, took on the case in the late 90s, after coming across evidence boxes marked ear in red lettering. He connected with the criminalist in Irvine County, Mary Hong. In 2001, crime labs in Contra County and Irvine compared DNA samples and were finally able to connect crimes to the same offender. The ear had significantly benefited from different police departments being historically terrible at sharing information and working together. His criminal career spanned from 1972 to 1986, 14 years of terror in multiple communities. He had acquired numerous names with each evolution, always just barely out of grasp of the police. He was intelligent and took great care in providing himself with multiple escape routes. He had seemingly unlimited patience, and shoe impressions were deep. He would stay crouched for hours when he was doing his recon. He would stalk potential targets for months, taking in every detail of their life. But he was volatile and unpredictable. In the presence of a victim, he broke down and said, "I hate you, Bonnie." But investigators had thought that the victim had misheard him, and they thought he had said, "Mommy." He would seem unstable. Sometimes women would sense it was like a show, like he was trying to make himself seem more dangerous, and sometimes they were positive it was genuine. His crimes changed California state law with Proposition 69. In 2004, California mandated DNA collection from all felons and adults and minors charged with certain crimes such as sexual offenses, murder, or arson. Keith Harrington's brother campaigned for the law, pledging nearly $2 million when it began. When it began, it gave California the largest working state DNA database in the country, second only to the FBI, and it was instrumental in solving multiple cold cases. Though investigators were disappointed that it brought nothing in the way of leads for the crimes they had been most hoping to solve. He prowled, burglarized neighborhoods of single-story homes. Single-story homes had more predictable escape routes. He would also get a 360 vantage of the home, and he could spend hours knowing no one could see him by being able to see overhead. His movements were subtle and mostly unnoticeable. An open gate here, things in the backyard moved slightly. A ladder quietly moved from against a fence in one yard to the garage of another home. He would creep along people's roofs, which most people wrote off as an animal because the idea that a man was on the roof of their home, using it as a way of getting a good look into their neighbor's window, was too absurd to put into words. People would clean their gutters in the years following his attacks, only to find jewelry stolen from their neighbor. Decades passed and his crimes became a thing of the past, like a reoccurring nightmare that you thought back on. And with those passing decades, new technologies arose. The Green River Killer was caught with DNA evidence, and he had known that technology would eventually catch up with him. Dennis Rader, the BTK, when he was arrested, detailed in his confessions that as he got older, it was more physically challenging to commit his crimes. After his last murder, he had stopped because he had a close call with the victim getting the upper hand. It is believed that these are why the Golden State Killer stopped attacking couples, because Greg Sanchez scared him. Even his last known victim was a single teenager that was home alone. After 1986, he disappeared, but in 2018, he was identified.
We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento. And with that, I would like to introduce our sheriff, Scott Jones.
Over the last few days, as information started to point towards this individual, we started some surveillance. We were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man. And yesterday afternoon, in a perfectly executed arrest, my detectives arrested James Joseph D'Angelo, 72 years old, living in Citrus Heights. I can tell you that although it was DNA, ultimately, that led us down the right road, there were a lot of places that road could have led.
In 2016, the FBI offered a $50,000 reward for any new information that led to an arrest. The initiative sparked new interest in the case. Paul Holes and his team of investigators took the ear's DNA profile taken from a victim's assault kit and uploaded it into the personal geometrics website called GEDmatch. This was used to reverse engineer a family tree. GEDmatch relies on DNA kits from websites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, where people voluntarily submit their DNA to create family trees and find more information about their ancestral lineage. GEDmatch was able to identify 10 distant relatives from the ear. From there, they worked with genealogists to create a large family tree. From the tree, they had 2 suspects. When they were able to rule out one, they were left with the Joseph James DeAngelo. Joseph James DeAngelo wasn't what they initially thought to be a perfect match. He was much older than the suspect they were looking for. He'd been born in 1945, putting him at 31 years old when he was attacking in the Sacramento area. Based on the witness accounts, they had always been looking for someone in their late teens. Regardless, DeAngelo was staked out for weeks. During this time, he was witnessed driving his motorcycle, exercising daily in his home. He moved in such a way that the cops watching him didn't believe he was a man in his 70s. He walked around like a man 20 years younger than he was. Who is Joseph James DeAngelo? And how did he evade capture for over 4 decades? Let's break down what we know. He was born on November 8, 1945. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was the second child to Kathleen and Joseph DeAngelo. Kathleen was a military housewife, typical of the time, and Joseph Sr. was in the Air Forces. Joseph Sr. fought in World War II and had been wounded serving as a gunner. The couple had 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. The family were stationed in military housing in the New York area for the first 5 years of JJ Jr.'s life. When the Korean War begins, the family is relocated to New Jersey, and then later to Washington. Joseph Sr. was well known for being a violent man. His superiors knew the abuse he inflicted on his wife, and he was threatened multiple times to stop hitting his wife or he'd be thrown out of the military. Kathleen was not a soft mother when her husband abused her. She would pass on the abuse to her children. The youngest daughter recounted the abuse, saying that all the kids would double up layers of clothing to lessen the blows. It was an altogether miserable household filled with loud chaos and violence. In 1952, Joseph Sr. was transferred to a base in Germany and the family followed. Then they were transferred back to New Jersey in 1954. It was in 1954 that something happened. Joseph James Jr., 9, and his youngest sister, who was 7 at the time, were playing in an abandoned warehouse. They were approached by 2 men who violently attacked his sister. When they told their parents about the incident, they were told to never speak of it. The family moved around almost yearly, transferring to different bases. In 1956, his father was transferred to California, and in 1959, records show he was transferred to the Mather Air Force Base, and the family purchased a small home in Rancho Cordova. Joseph James Jr. was 14 when he started middle school in Northern California. He attended the Folsom High School in 1961, which was why detectives had a hard time finding a suspect in local yearbooks. They were looking in the wrong decade. In 1963, his father was transferred to Orlando, and he filed for divorce from Kathleen. Kathleen and the kids stayed in California, and his mother took up with another military man named Jack Basenko. In September 1964, Joseph James Jr. got his GED and enlisted in the Navy on a 4-year enlistment. While he was overseas, his mother and Jack got married, and she begins waitressing at the Auburn Denny's. Joseph Jr. served in 3 deployments from 1965 to 1967 during the Vietnam War. His time during deployment is often a little murky. He has vast periods of time unaccounted for, and he was even reported as AWOL for 3 days while back in the U.S. He was deployed in 1968 on a non-combat deployment. When the Vietnam War was at its peak, he was exempt from the draft. He was allowed to attend college back in California, and began attending the Sierra College in Rockland when he was 22 years old. In 1969, his father had remarried and altogether abandoning his first family and was posted in Korea. Joseph Jr. met Bonnie Caldwell in college. She was 18 and he was 23. Bonnie described him as an energetic and worldly Vietnam vet. Soon after meeting, the two were engaged, but Bonnie began seeing red flags early on. He was often very rough with her, especially in the bedroom, and she had finally had enough. In 1971, she broke things off, and she said he began aggressively stalking her. She said he had even attempted to force her by gunpoint to marry him. Fortunately, her father had chased him away. She dropped out of school for a semester and changed her major to put as much space between her and DeAngelo as she could. Bonnie married an accountant in 1972, and Joseph purchased his first home less than 2 miles from Bonnie. 1972 was when Rancho Cordova began receiving calls from a cat burglar. In 1973, D'Angelo graduated with honors with a degree in criminal justice from the California State University in Sacramento. He then started an internship with the Roseville Police Department, which was near Citrus Heights. He was there for around 8 months before signing on with the Exeter Police Department as an officer. He was 27. A coworker described him as too smart and overqualified to be at the small police department. Everyone was confused as to why he wanted to be there. In this year, there was an escalation in the cat burglaries, and a dog had been killed, and the robberies were spreading from Rancho Cordova to the Citrus Heights area as well as Carmichael. In 1973, D'Angelo also married Sharon Hubbard in the fall. D'Angelo started taking night classes at the police academy at the College of Sequoias. This was where Claude Snelling had been a professor. D'Angelo was promoted to sergeant, and according to a coworker, D'Angelo and his wife were living in Visalia, and he would commute to Exeter. During his first year of marriage was when the Visalia ransacker was at its peak. He wouldn't have been investigating his own break-ins, but when Claude Snelling had been murdered, multiple police departments were called in to help with the manhunt, and this included the Exeter department. After the McGowan shooting, D'Angelo transferred to the Auburn Police Department, a 45-minute drive from Rancho Cordova. After he moves to Auburn, the Visalia ransackings abruptly stopped. He officially starts with the Auburn Police Department in June or July of 1976, and the first attack from the ear was on June 18, 1976. There is a very high likelihood that he investigated his crimes while at the Auburn Police Department. During the entirety of the ear attacks, he was with the Auburn Police Department, but was fired in August 1979 for stealing dog repellent and a hammer from a hardware store in Citrus Heights. He had been caught on July 2nd and suspended until his termination. He did appeal, but later withdrew. His boss reported that after he fired D'Angelo, his daughter saw a man looking in through her window, and when he went outside, the man was gone, but there were fresh shoe impressions around his entire house. When he heard D'Angelo was arrested in connection to the ear attacks, he was confident that D'Angelo had been the man at his home that night. July 5th was the last attack in the ear attacks. D'Angelo was officially unemployed from 1980, but it was believed he was doing odd jobs working under the table. His wife was finishing her law degree around that time. During the original Night Stalker attacks, he would be about in his mid-30s, and it is unclear what his connection to Goleta was. D'Angelo's wife was pregnant for the first time in 1981, and she gave birth to their first daughter. Her second pregnancy was in 1986, and just after becoming pregnant, there was the slaying of Janelle Cruz. He had a third daughter in 1989, and it was that year that his wife asked him for a divorce. In Citrus Heights, he owned a home on Canyon Oak Drive. As far as the government knew, he was unemployed until 1990. He began working as a mechanic at the Save Mart Distribution Center in Roseville, and he worked there until he retired. He and his wife are in family court records in 1991. This was believed to be their separation. They never formally divorced until D'Angelo was arrested in 2018, but Sharon lived with her daughters in Roseville, where she practiced law as a divorce lawyer. In 1994, D'Angelo's younger brother was arrested for burglary in LA. There is a theory that D'Angelo enlisted his brother to assist him in the attacks, but at this point there is little evidence to support that theory. After his separation, he lived a relatively quiet life in Citrus Heights. His neighbors reported him as being often an irritable grouch. However, one neighbor received multiple phone calls from D'Angelo threatening to deliver a load of death because of their barking dog. He wasn't an animal person. He retired from his mechanic job in 2017, and his daughter and granddaughter were living with him in his Citrus Heights home when he was arrested in 2018. At his arrest, he didn't seem surprised. He did ask officers to turn the oven off because there was a roast in there. There weren't many people singing his praises. He He is often described as a serious stickler for rules type that never fit in. He wasn't close to his family either, with many of his siblings estranged. He's been in police custody since 2018. Most notable was his change in physical capabilities from the time of his arrest to when he was wheeled into the courtroom in his wheelchair with his lawyer to hear his charges. He seemed to be having trouble standing unassisted, when he'd been seen by police only weeks earlier zipping around on his motorcycle. His lawyer also seemed to be speaking to him very loudly, as if he couldn't hear perfectly fine during his arrest. The drastic change from how he was when he was in court to when he was being surveilled was like night and day. He seemed to have aged himself about 20 years once he was arrested. He was no longer a man who could exercise daily, but he needed to be pushed in a wheelchair. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. pled guilty to 76 crimes in order to avoid the death penalty. In August 2020, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is now being held under protective custody at the California State Prison. For decades, it seemed as though there would be no answers to these horrific crimes. Finally, there is a resolution and a criminal behind bars. A face finally unmasked and exposed. The remainder of his life will be served in a prison cell. The following video is from his sentencing hearing.
Murder in the first degree, how do you plead?
He blindfolded her and told her to lie face down. He returned to the bedroom to place more dishes on her husband's body and told him, quote, "If these dishes fall, I'll kill everyone in the house." He then cut her nightgown in several places with a knife and proceeded to rape her.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry.
Mr. DeAngelo, I sentence you to the following. Sentences the defendant to an additional sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The aggregate sentence for Joseph James DeAngelo is the following. For counts 2 and 14 through 13, he's committed to the state prison for the indeterminate term of 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence to run consecutive to the indeterminate life term for count 26. The weapons enhancements in counts 4, 5, 7, and 26 consist of an aggregate determinate term of 8 years to run consecutive. Another way to state the sentence is as follows. Mr. DeAngelo is sentenced to a total of 11 life without the possibility of parole sentences, plus an additional life sentence, plus an additional 8 years. This is the absolute maximum sentence the court is able to impose under the law, and while the court has no power to make a determination of where the defendant is imprisoned, the survivors have spoken clearly. The defendant deserves no mercy. Pursuant to Penal Code Section 290 or 290, you must register as a sex offender with the chief of the police in the city or the sheriff or the county in which you reside for the remainder of your life. You must submit to an AIDS test. Pursuant to Penal Code Section 1202.1, you are advised that you may never own or possess a firearm or ammunition for the rest of your life. You are ordered to satisfy the requirements of Penal Code Section 296 and 296.1 by providing DNA samples as well as thumb and palm prints. Having waived your appeal rights, the advisement of appellate rights are not applicable. The court reporter will prepare a transcript of these sentencing proceedings to be filed for any future dates. Counsel, is there anything else before we adjourn?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Mr. DeAngelo, you're now remanded to the custody of the Sheriff of Sacramento to be delivered to the custody of Director of Corrections and Rehabilitation to serve the remainder of your life in state prison. We are adjourned.